That's the sound coming to us.
Okay.
This just tells you what it's picking up. So it's telling you there's not a lot of sound. This only controls what we grid playback. It doesn't control the input.
Okay. Do you stay back here then, or do you go up there?
When I was doing this, I'll stay back here because it shuts down.
Yeah. Okay.
Just so you know, it looks weird, but they're saying this. Right? You see this backwards? It's just what we're saying.
Yeah.
Feel free to do whatever you like if you want. I practice.
I think I'll grab my stuff and come back here.
That's great. That's great.
I don't want to sit in front of this.
You ready to go? Pull that up closer to you, Meredith. There we go. All right, you're live.
Okay, I'm going to call this meeting to order. I want to, actually, I don't have to make the mask reminder, so they are recommended to be worn, but they are not required. Let's start to establish that we have a quorum for this meeting, beginning with a roll call vote. I'll start with Joe.
Here.
Jen?
Here.
Yana? Here. Christina?
Here.
Nicole? Here. And I am here as well. We have a quorum. Jen, has this meeting been properly noticed?
It has.
Okay. To ensure that we're centering our board work around our shared values and serving students, I'm going to read tonight's mission and equity statement. Our equity statement is each student has access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment in their education, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, ability, language, family background, or family income. Our results policy mission statement is each student will acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to achieve their personal goals, thrive in a diverse global society, and lead a healthy, self-fulfilling life. Okay, are there any questions or comments on the remainder of the agenda? It is a hefty one tonight. Okay, hearing none, is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So
I have a motion from Yana, is there a second?
second.
Second for Jen, all in favor signify with aye. Tonight's agenda has been adopted. Okay, as I said, we have a hefty agenda tonight, so we're going to move directly into the superintendent report. We have a lot of information to cover, so please hold questions until we're ready to do the presentation for them. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Purdy.
And good evening, everyone. Thank you for your attendance today. And as our president so wonderfully stated, it should be one must be good, very heavy agenda today. It's going to be worthwhile information for our community and aspects of our work that we really think will drive the future of our district for the next at least 4 to 5 years. And so we really want to engage in a thoughtful conversation today, and we appreciate the audience. Before we go any further, I want to take this opportunity to give recognition to our Brown School District retirees. As you think about our service to education and what it means to thousands and thousands of students that these highly valuable educators have engaged with over the course of their careers, we're looking at a total of 233 years of service to the field of education and to the Brown area community. So on the screen behind me, we want to make sure that we acknowledge and give a strong VASD shout out to these retirees and wish them the best as they move forward in post-education life, but know that they'll always have a family with the Brown Area School District. So, Round of applause for our retirees.
Meredith, I know you said I can't say anything until appropriate, but because I work really closely with almost every single person on this list for a fairly decent amount of time. And wow. I certainly feel like sitting in this seat is partially due to each of those folks on that list. So I'd like to extend my gratitude to all of those people on the list for retiring and their commitment to kids. I'm incredibly grateful personally and just on behalf of the district.
Thanks, Jen. I think, looking at this list, they're all familiar names. Some friends, some have been impacted directly by family through Graham's education, some both with friends and their educators. It is hard to see so many talented educators move on to the next chapter, but very excited for them, even less sad for everyone else.
Same here. My own children have had several of these educators, and you can see decades and decades of experience touching kids' lives. Having teachers, do so much for our community. So thank you so much to them.
All right, thank you. And again, we wish them a great retirement, and I can also advocate for our HR department that we always have some openings if you are so inclined to join us on those needy days. We would love to have you back. I want to give a quick update on our COVID numbers. We are at the number of 20 positive cases over a 7-day period. Still keeps us well under the 1% threshold that we want none, but we won't stay under the 1% threshold, and we are still well below that. We do acknowledge that we did some additional communication out, specifically to New Century to address a smaller, a number there in that building, and we took some additional mitigation efforts to strengthen our stance in that space. Otherwise, you can see, especially at the secondary level, a significant decrease. We are, again, pleased with the efforts of our mitigation strategies and thank our community for their support as we navigate this troubled pandemic. I want to highlight definitely growth in our coverage, which was a sub-coverage, which was a severe issue coming out of winter break. As you can see, we're averaging over 90% for sub-coverage rates, and we are so thankful for our staff that jumped in and chipped in throughout the pandemic to keep us going, keep our doors open, and our numbers were high. And with that, I'm going to call Chad and become like Chad and Pete to the stage. Any questions on anything about COVID or COVID numbers?
Dr. Perry, can I just ask a point of clarification for some families? I know you mentioned that with this cases at New Century, there will be some additional mitigation. I just don't want anyone in the community maybe caught off guard by that. So is that something that if you're just doing by building, depending on where there might be cases? Or
yeah, these are. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so these are efforts when we notice that there's maybe a larger number in a specific area or a specific classroom, we will try to strengthen the mitigation efforts and also do an awareness factor. So the letter went out Friday, making families aware to continue to watch for symptoms and things of that nature. So it's both communication and strategies that go along with that.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely. All right. Absolutely.
Path. I change your path.
I wish I could say, like, there's something to shout out to Yana, excited for this finance meeting, and the amount of work that is being absorbed by this woman on our behalf, she sends her, is, at one point I asked if they were losing me for this. It's pretty intense. So Yana, your report is greatly appreciated. How much time you're putting into the finance piece.
Good evening, everyone.
It's not bad.
No, it was on.
Mr. Attorney, can we transition microphones and then go back again? Thank you.
We'll back up here now. All right. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see the board again. To Dr. Clarity's opening statements, we do have a full agenda this evening, so Pete and I will attempt to be as concise as possible, but certainly want to make sure we share some new information and answer any questions the board might have. So with no further ado, we will, here's our goal for what we want to share with the board this evening. We have what hopefully is a quick budget amendment, an update on our 21-22 budget. And this may be the first and only budget amendment for the year, but also could be one of another, we could have another one or two on the way. And a preview with the board, and I'm not sure if this has been done in previous administrations or boards, but Pete and I will certainly get in the habit if we are finding things in that initial past budget that the board finally finalized in October that have changed. It'll be our goal that we will keep the board in the loop in terms of some assumptions that we've seen and some changes that we've seen along the way, and actually ask them to vote on a new amended and adopted budget that then Pete will turn right around and submit it to DPI to make sure we're as accurate as possible throughout the school year. Things do change in terms of where we allocate, in particular, expected expenditures. But in the case tonight, we actually have an update to a revenue that will exist this coming year. We're going to do a quick 22-23 budget update. Update the board on where we're at with our budget calendar, with a couple of new additions on the way. We'll have some recommended adjustments to the 22-23 budget. And again, we're kind of tracking our way towards July when we hit the summer. We asked the board to pass a preliminary budget out of that annual meeting. We will walk through that budget adjustment, and this will be kind of where Meredith was mentioning some of the heavy lifting we've been doing behind the scenes with Yana, and how our budget at 22-23 connects to our proposed ESSER budget. And we'll be interested in the board's feedback on our initial recommended budget for about that $2 million spend of federal funds. That will dovetail right into that ESSER update. That will have a progress update on the referendum subcommittee that's been happening with the board, and progress we're making towards a potential vote later on in the summer, and then a brief staffing update in terms of where we're at during hiring season and staffing our buildings for next year. There will be several slides along the way to pause for questions if any of those do pop up. So I'm actually going to have Pete walk through the work he's been doing to amend our current 21-22 year budget. And Dr. Clary, I do believe there's a board vote later on in this evening's agenda as we work our way through this, but we want to make sure if there are any questions around some slight tweaks to our bottom line that we can answer them now. So Pete.
Thank you, Chad. Yeah, I'm just going to follow up on what Chad was saying, and for budget transfers and amendments, basically anytime we're changing a budget, that is good practice for the district. It's good reason, or I'm sorry, it's good for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's given a little more transparency, so you're able to see how the year is progressing, I should say. And it also benefits all the school districts in Wisconsin. Now, how does it do that? Well, on July 1st, DPI gives an estimated equalization aid for the next school year, and they base that off of all the known factors and what they are estimating, and for their estimates, all they have left is what everyone has in their budget. So if we have an updated budget and all the other 400 and some odd school districts update their budget, it's going to make it a more accurate aid estimate for everybody. So we're planning on going ahead and doing this as often as we can to help not just us, but it's going to help everybody. So on this slide, I just listed 4 of the major things that have moved. There was actually probably about 40 or 50 different transactions, but of the larger ones that are on here, we have an adjustment of one-time state aid that we had talked about in October when we passed the budget. There was a one-time aid that came through a little better than what we had estimated. We do have increased open enrollment revenue, so we ended up getting a little more revenue that way, and there's also a little less open enrollment expense. And finally, there's an adjustment for our summer school expenses. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Now, this slide that we have here is a DPI, I'm not going to say recommended, I'm going to say it's more of a suggested format on how you can report your budget changes. And what I want to point out on this is the middle column there where it says 21-22 approved budget, that is the budget that was approved in October. So the column next to it that says 21-22 amended budget, that is listing what we think the changes are going to be and what the new budget would be as of tonight. So when Chad and I bring another one of these budget adjustments to you, the next time you see this sheet, the column that says 21-22 amended budget, that will be the new approved budget because it will have been approved tonight, hopefully. So that's about all I have on here. Is there any follow-ups?
So the only other thing I would point out to the board is that you can see that there are some updated, essentially budgets on the bottom column there in terms of expenditures. So those went up slightly, and the main reason for that is, to Pete's point, we had additional funds available from our recalculation in state aid. We originally under budgeted, in my opinion, for our expected expenditures for summer school. And we are building out summer school right now, and that will be in the mix as well. And Pete, I don't know, even a quick example to the board. You've been working closely with Pam at the high school, where we may have had a certain department budget that Pam has moved $2,000 from one department line to another that potentially could have changed an account. And when that's done, we can update the budgets in Skyward and then submit that back to DPI. So there were many moving pieces behind the scenes, but not a substantial change to the bottom line in terms of the overall essentially $80 million budget that's back in October. So certainly here to answer questions if folks have any. And again, this is a public record and we publish on DPI shortly after he submits it.
I have a question. If you look at the column for the amended budget, the anticipated revenues and the total expenditure appropriations don't match up anymore. They're slightly off. Is there a reason for that?
That is correct. Pete actually has this number tattooed. We've seen it so many times.
$27,944.
It's
a surplus.
That's it. It's a good catch, but now our budget has 27 surplus because of the slight changes.
Is that any state statutes that states that your budget has to zero out, or is it okay?
It is okay if a budget is out of balance. If it happens quite regularly, actually. And we have an example of pretty large.
Can you see it? Because I don't know if it is.
I think
we're actually.
Yeah, there will actually, probably not this year, but potentially for our upcoming budget. We have currently a hold on a large property that the district's paying kind of a holding price. That's a 5-year window for us to buy some acreage for a potential high school. So an example of us passing a negative budget in terms of revenues and expenditures could happen in the near future, where if we close on that property for an estimated $4 million, we would actually submit a budget to the board that would be negative.
I was able to
because,
hear out there my test.
our revenues would not meet our
So
expected
why don't we
expenditures.
tell you for now, we'll
and
fix
pull
it.
that expenditure out of fund balance,
Doing
because we're
something.
holding that money for the property purchase.
That's good.
So many school districts on an annual basis try to have a balanced budget, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it can go on either side of the budget. Thank you for those questions. They were very good ones. All right, a quick update on our budget calendar. The board has seen this many times now, but there are a few things I wanted to highlight this evening. We did promise a brief update to the school board on progress we're making on projected insurance renewal rates. Those conversations are ongoing. Rochelle is still meeting with them on a weekly, sometimes a couple times a week basis. That number is still trending towards 4 or just under 4% in terms of where we think we'll end up with a recommended renewal rate for the board in the upcoming week. We'll actually ask you to vote on it next month. We're still exploring the possibility of minimizing the expense for this upcoming year because it's going to be, as you know, a really tough budget, but also the possibility of a 2 or 3 year extension. So a total of a 3-year agreement. If the numbers don't come in really good on year 2 and 3, there's a good chance you hear from us next fall, and we're going to send the thing back out to RFP and go through the bidding process again. We didn't feel that the timing was right with the new administration, COVID, everything else happening to our staff members to kind of go through the potential of a plan design change or a writing provider this year. But if we can't get those numbers more reasonable, and we're kind of seeing for renewal rates in year 2 and 3, there's a decent chance that we would push for opening the thing all the way back up down the road. So I wanted to give the board an update on that. And we'll get a more formal presentation in the coming months around insurance renewals. I highlighted that on the second arrow on our calendar. 3 brief callouts, and just wanted to make sure we kept everybody on the same page as we're tracking towards a potential vote this summer regarding an operating referendum. So we have added that date as a kind of a board meeting target as we're working our way through this spring on a potential vote for an operating referendum, but did add that to the calendar so the board continued to see that. And then just 2 other things to kind of talk around some of the technicalities of what the fall might look like. So we will work our way through the annual budget process and get to an early summer vote on passing a preliminary budget that would be essentially shared with the public as part of that annual meeting process. And then we get ourselves to October, and if the board did vote on an operating referendum in October, when we got to that October 24th date, after Pete has all his numbers, we know what happened with third tribe account. We know what's happened with property value. We have all of the appropriate information to present the board with a finalized budget that we would pass. That would be the meeting that we potentially would actually hold 2 votes. And we would hold a vote for a preliminary budget in a non-passing referendum amendment. We'd finalize it at that point. And a second vote on what the budget would look like, depending on how all of the referendum discussions shake out for a passing budget. I wanted to kind of see if the board had any questions on that. There is a chance at that meeting, if the board continues to kind of push us towards a mill rate neutral budget, that the bottom line in terms of the mill rate could be exactly the same. And you could pass 2 budgets that have identical mill rates, but if a referendum passed on the operating side, the budget lines would look different. And we'd have more expected expenditures in Fund 10 and a little less in Fund 39 if everything kind of fell into place and the board approved things later this summer. So I wanted the board to know that that was on the way. It seems like a long ways off, but we'll be sitting here in the end of October before we know it. And we've got the election day, if there were something on the ballot, would be November 8th, and Pete would have a frenzied 48 hours, and we'd have to certify a tax levy and make sure that we were checking all the boxes with all of our municipalities. So that's kind of a lot. I'll pause briefly there to see if folks have questions on the calendar. Wonderful. All right, and here's where I think we can be a little concise because some of this is review, but wanted to remind the board that on January 24th, the last time we had a marathon session in terms of an update on finance, we shared with the board back then, we thought CPI was going to be 4.56. We were targeting a minor increase to health insurance. And we built some assumptions into an initial budget around what it would look like to give a cost of living increase to all of our staff, credit for a year of service, hire 4 new FTE, and not spend any S1. And that's kind of why we're making those connections tonight. And we were sitting there and looking at a $5 million budget deficit for just an initial crack and an idea of what a budget might look like. So we made a lot of progress since then. And that progress has included this slide, where we've worked back and forth with the board and have ourselves to at least a place that we believe we could pass a budget, not cut a bunch of staff, and get ourselves to a spot that at this point we have a surplus budget that we're working our way through with the board and have some back and forth that we've been doing. I did want to call out the fact that we had added an additional basic revenue source that Dr. Clarity has been working closely with our finance team and has identified an additional $200,000 that he'd like to allocate towards the bottom line in terms of trying to put us in as much surplus as possible as we're just continuing contract negotiations with VAEA and VASD. So that is a new addition there.
Jen, should we maybe one to, so clarification, we only have like extra $200,000 laying around a secret superintendent safe. But as no serious, as we looked at what's called the superintendent's account or the budget, a lot of those things are consulting and supports some of the work we're doing with the ASPER group could be considered part of that, the trainings and things of that nature. I also know that there was a very specific organizational structure shift by the Board of Education that I think along with not just the allocation of our central office of expectation that we continue to grow our internal capacity along the way. And so as we look at growing our internal capacity, we feel like there's some elements of the training we could do ourselves and have that part of central office, as well as understanding that we can't articulate that in any one dimension to report the classroom and other resources in the classroom. So we're making an effort to look at items within central office and make sure that those supports are appropriately placed in our buildings and staffing and making sure that our students and teachers are all staffing.
Thank you for that, Dr. Clarity. Pete and I also both made Dr. Clarity give us a handshake agreement that this time next year, he wouldn't be darkening the door of the finance office asking for funds after he's cut $200,000 from his budget, but it is appreciated. We've got 2 quick updates in terms of what those final budget numbers on a potential budget as we're tracking towards July might look like. This is a reminder to the board that we were at $109,000 of surplus. I did circle as a reminder, the additional $2 million of federal funds that were big in getting us to closing that gap. And we shared that with you on the 24th. That number has moved up slightly, not all $200,000, as Pete's continued to refine the preliminary budget. Again, that has a little bit of summer school in there, and we're expanding summer school offerings. We also had to expand the expected expenditures related to that. But we are in a spot right now that we have a preliminary budget that has $250,000 of surplus. I do want to remind the board that this budget at this point, pending a potential referendum, still does not include credit for a year of service for VAEA or investment members or anything related to CPI. It is a balanced budget. It is a budget that we would keep all of our existing staff members in our district. It is a budget, to Dr. Clary's point, that has protected the classroom and class sizes, building-based budgets, but it is not a budget at this point that does, on July 1st, have anything in the books as far as staff compensation. I want to make sure the board is clear with that. But it does have that additional $2 million federal funds that will be connected to our next topic. As a reminder to the board, I've gone back and forth with this slide a number of times with a large number of people over the last couple months, and it's been quite useful for us to continue to kind of work through what we're up against. I don't know if Rhiannon's back there and can clear whatever popped up on the queue. So as a reminder, this is really the kind of the budget battle we're up against as far as where our budget meets staff compensation for next year. So it would be that $250,000 surplus for us to potentially get to a spot where we get all of our employees credit for your service. It costs an additional $788,000. So we're kind of $500,000 short to give our staff credit for your service pre-referendum. Again, if the referendum did pass and you all voted on it, we would get it. And then kind of accordingly, about every percentage point in accordance with CPI is about an additional $500,000 of additional revenue we would need to give CPI adjustments to our staff. We want to make sure the board continue to kind of hold that in their back pocket as we're having discussions.
Jeff, can I ask 2 questions?
Please.
First, could you remind me again what CPI is?
Yeah, so that's the consumer price index. So it's interchangeable with COLA, so kind of cost of living. It is a number that the Department of Revenue posts on an annual basis towards the end of January. It's also the number that legally our teachers unions can collectively bargain up to. So that is, that's a big number on an annual basis that's posted. I didn't do the refresh slide because I wanted to keep things concise tonight. But as a reminder, that number over the last 15 years has been anywhere from slightly negative to about 2.5%. So anything north of 4 is incredibly high. As we're heading into continued conversations around our budget and budget projections this spring, we posted a really big January number again. We're all kind of seeing what's happening around the world as far as the state of the economy. And at this point, we, pre-referendum, I think it will be important for the board to continue to have an eye on what inflation and the consumer price index might be doing down the road. We want to build up this morning for a gallon. We're all going to feel that down the road, and at least in the short term, it doesn't feel like inflation is slowing down. So this, our budget without a potential referendum ask is going to continue to run into the toolbox.
That was my second question. The exact words were speaking, but I've been in my head just replacing that with inflation. So I know I've been watching inflation increase, and so it sounds like they're on top.
Yeah, that it's fair to make those as a kind of
Thank you.
Chad, can I ask something real quick? Could you go ahead a couple slides to the projection summary you have? My question is just in the future fiscal years, does the assumption about freezing steps and CPI apply to the numbers in future fiscal years too, or are the assumptions back that you do normal steps for those years?
In the future years, I just plugged a percentage.
An assumption for CPI and
Well,
stuff?
just an assumption for CPI that covers everything. It was 3% increase. So whatever the total salary was, let's increase that by 3%. So that's the change.
Okay, thank you.
which is a little higher than average, but again, looking at the state of the economy, as we continue to refine these numbers, by the time we actually get to a potential July vote, Pete and I will bring updated models. We may build in a little higher assumption for the following fiscal year around what we think inflation is going to be at. But yeah, he did build in 3% for state base. We also built in additional FTE in mind. Okay, any other questions there? All right, so I'm seeing lots of headlines, kind of how that ESSER funding connects to how we managed our budget this year. But it also connects on the board and districts kind of risk tolerance around when and how we spend ESSER funds. So in general, the budget I'm going to share with you this evening, there isn't a whole lot of new and exciting programming and innovation that's going along with that added $2 million of ESSER expenditure. I'm going to share a budget with you that essentially supplants many of the good things we already have going on in the district. Instead of paying for it out of normal kind of student-based allocation that's coming from the state of Wisconsin, for a year or two, we're paying for that stuff with federal funding. And many school districts in the state are finding themselves in this position. Clearly, you have something to add there.
Absolutely. So just from some deeper perspective, and I just kind of tolerate this for a second. So as per my contract, I am assigned to the National Convention for Superintendents, ASA, which took place approximately 2 to 3 weeks ago. During that national conference, I was given some things that I knew contextually, but when you see it play out in real time with our colleagues around the nation, that there were specific sessions for superintendents that were specifically designed how they effectively use ESSER funding for the advancement of education and acceleration of learning loss for the pandemic as it was originally designed to do. Unfortunately, the people of Wisconsin could not do those sessions because each Wisconsin superintendent is unfortunately using ESSER to close gaps that were specifically due to the $0 increase. So we think about a national educational model where we should be advancing, accelerating what we know was traumatic gaps. We are being almost forced into this space to maintain a status quo and to provide our staffing with the financing that they require. We are being forced to use what was intended to be federal dollars to compensate for that loss. So I just wanted to put it back in this space and for the community space of what we're dealing with in the state of Wisconsin, kind of our why behind this component, and a comparative analysis when we see it in real time of what ESSER was originally designed.
Thanks for that. And there are some area school districts that are potentially presenting a slightly cleaner budget. Some school districts are just saying, these 20 positions that already exist for next coming school year, we'll use that for ESSER. We've broken down the budget a little bit more so the community can have an understanding of some of the already ongoing work that's happening in the district that will be funded through ESSER funds. But I definitely don't want the board to get the impression that if we use ESSER funds as a revenue to pay for the things I'm going to explain tonight, that 2 years down the road when the ESSER fund goes away, that these are the things that would end up uncompromised, because that's not the case. These are things that we can justify to the public, to the federal government, that are evidence-based interventions, that are ongoing services that are good for kids, but we're short money and we need to build a budget that kind of check our boxes and we're not going tonight. So as a reminder to the board, we ended up with about $3.6 million over 2 years for ESSER 3. That's really the budget the board hasn't seen yet. You've seen the ESSER 1 and the ESSER 2 budget, and we'll go through that tonight. The funding does have to be spent by September 30th of 2024, and it's intended to safely reopen and sustain a safe school operation and also address the impact of the coronavirus that related to the pandemic. So this is a consolidated list of what you find on the federal website. These are a few of the things that you could use your federal funding for. There is a requirement that 20% of your budget has to go towards evidence-based interventions. And I've checked some of the boxes tonight that would meet that category as we submit our finalized budget. What the federal government there was trying to avoid would be only redoing HVAC or only upgrading facilities and doing nothing towards learning loss, and that's certainly not the case in terms of what we present with our budget. But I did want to highlight the fact that it is okay, and in some cases like Wisconsin, almost needed, that we can supplant current district funds with federal funds, and that's what we're talking about. So this is right off the federal website, but I want to just make sure the board has this information, that the federal government is asking that we make sure that we have an eye on many of the same things we talk about on a monthly basis as a board and certainly as a district, around making sure that our subgroups are targeted and our focus groups are targeted related to these funds, and that's certainly the case with some of the things I'm sure that we'll be listening. So lastly, here is what would be eventually, and we will take this once we get feedback from the board this spring, actually as early as next month, And we will hold some informational sessions for our community and our ways we're spending ESSER funds. In an ideal state, in my mind, this process could look much different. To Dr. Clarity's point, if we had $3.6 million of extra money, think of what community input sessions could look like on new and innovative things, places that families have seen holes in our system that we could fill. We could do all of this amazing information gathering and bring a report back to Dr. Clarity and the board for ways, and that's much of what Dr. Clarity was hearing at the National Superintendent's Convention on that process. Ways we're involved in the community to come up with innovative ways to spend our money. Unfortunately, again, this is a list of things that we're still planning out of our budget for the coming year to get to that balanced budget that we presented earlier to the board. So this is an initial crack at that budget. The main thing the board needs to concentrate on is the fact that we have about $400,000 in remaining ESSER 2 funds. And then we have targeted about $1.5 million, $1.6 million from ESSER 3 for the upcoming 22-23 school year. And then we have, for the time being, $1.7 million of funding set aside for the 23-24 school year. And I've kind of got Yana in my ear from our meeting on January 24th, who asked a follow-up question on moving ESSER funds and what the bottom line would look like in the 24-25 and the 26-27 fiscal years. And if we decide with some board feedback that we'd like to move some of that ESSER revenue around, it certainly is setting us up again for having a little bit more of a fiscal cliff, some of that money moved towards the 22-23 school year and didn't stay as is. So I'm wide open to questions and your feedback relative to this draft ESSER budget. We will ask kind of over the next couple of board meetings that we reach some closure with the school board on the draft stamp relative to this budget. It will be a number we will pencil in as we're moving towards June and July, but will also be the budget that we share with the community. There will likely be a survey on our website, a couple of community input sessions, so at the very least the community is informed around our current best thinking around how to use ESSER funding. And then by the time we get to June and July, would be a number that would be a little more cemented into the budget as far as federal funding for factors. So I'm certainly here to answer any questions you might have on how to initial page a budget relative to the remaining ESSER 2 and future ESSER 3 revenues.
So I have a quick question. As we look at our budget for 2023, we're at a little bit over 255,000. And I know in our last board meeting, you talked about a staff neutral plan. So where does that put us with hiring for open positions? I know we mentioned at our last meeting that we also did mass posting. So where does that put us with bringing in new staff?
Yeah, so we have stuck to our plan around staying staffing neutral. And that has meant that some of our schools that are projected to be slightly lower in enrollment, we may have to shift some of our FTE to a school that was going to be up in enrollment. It's also meant that we can leverage retirements down the road, potentially move FTE around. But the bottom line, kind of per the direction I gave Rochelle and the HR team and one of Dr. Hawkins, was to stay FTE neutral and move down. So now that additional $250,000 that currently exists in the budget, at least for the time being, has not been converted into staff. It hasn't been converted into staff compensation. We're still have ongoing talks and negotiations with the ADA and WESPA, and that number could turn into a zero if we end up coming up with an agreement in terms of staff compensation. That number could go down slightly as we update the board if we decide there's a 1.0 FTE we can't do without. We couldn't move the right pieces around through retirement, and we needed to add some teaching staff to our bottom line. But for the time being, we have stuck to our word, and we are staffing next year's buildings with a staffing neutral stance because the budget's so tight.
So would we be able to, well, you might have another answer, but if we moved over more ESSER money for 2023, 2022. The next school year, if we moved over more ESSER instead of the 1.7 being there for the 2023-2024 school year, there was less. What would that look like? What would their expectations be for shifting a little bit more over to next year?
That's a great question. There are certainly been school districts in the state who have taken that approach. And so if we move those federal dollars over, let's even say it was $500,000 over to the 22-23 budget funding and pull the 23-24 from 1.7 to $1.2 million. That would give the administration and eventually the school board the flexibility in my mind to really do two things that are hanging over us right now that are kind of unfinished business. So it may give us the possibility, if there is a teacher hire or a support staff hire, that is a need we know we have post-July 1, it would give us the flexibility to potentially add a staff member or two out of the budget. And it would also give us the flexibility to have a little more available funding to continue the collective bargaining that's going on with our team meetings. The obvious flip side of that is we are becoming a little bit more reliant on a very strong message around what would exist in an operating environment. And kind of the budget challenges we would be up against if a referendum were not to pass, if you all voted for one, and if the next biennial budget that will hit us in 23-24, if that comes in not so great, we kept away at the $1.7 million insurance policy and kind of held on. So you have a couple of variables in terms of a potential referendum vote and a state budget that we're taking a little bit more of a chance on. But this is, I'll be frank with you, this is relatively conservative in terms of what I've seen from other school districts in terms of what they're doing with ESSER funding.
I think for the sake of the board, it needs to be transparent about this. And it revolves around the very clear expectations of the board was placed, and rightfully so, in administration before. Retaining high quality staff. And what the cost control, the zero movement in extension means and zero movement in CPI means for the administration to be in compliance with the expectations of making staff results within the space.
On that same note, are there any areas as we were doing this budget that all the numbers are situated so nicely? Are there any areas that we were not able to fund anywhere near what we know students need outside of staff salaries? Because I think we all agree that not being able to get any raises is unacceptable. But were there other things that show on here that like this funding lays out nicely, but this is actually a huge decrease in staff?
The budget Pete has worked on going forward in many cases, in most cases, has been sufficient in terms of where we think we need next year's budget. And again, this budget is laid out to supplant many of our ongoing expenses just because we're short of revenue for next year. The one place in particular that Pete and I have been working diligently with is Dr. Hawkins and the academic services budget that had historically been overspent. And it happens in many school districts where under budget one area, tweaks of the budget won't happen at the right time in the school year, and you may end up at the end of the year, $300,000 with a $300,000 surplus in utilities, and another budget might run 6 figures in the red. And you're supposed to do what you can to make sure that doesn't happen the following year. Quite frankly, that is one of the areas we've been targeting to make sure we get right, because it targets the classroom. It will perfectly align with what we're going to eventually do around the strategic framework. We heard Dr. Hawkins tonight, and we're going to measure science learning and growth. And it shouldn't be a budget that we're finding ourselves short at every year. So we targeted that on purpose, but that budget won't be sufficient. There's still going to have to be local funds backing it up, and that budget can end up more like $500,000 or $600,000 by the time the budget's passed, but the revenue source, at least partially, will be from federal funding. So I don't know if that answered that perfectly, but there are certainly places out there that we won't pay for every school nurse out of ESSER funding, and a portion of school nursing will be paid for as a way that we report to the federal government.
I appreciate the call out for the specific area, and I think it resonates with the community also how many times we use the words that, and so that's clarity and the you love to be moving forward instead, and growing up students and being aggressive in the academic services of the best. And I'm interested that we're being this administration is doing to use the funds we have to do so. Thank you, I appreciate it.
So Chuck, I would say I'm very good at in terms of financial picture. In a situation where it's financial disconversion versus what we are charging versus, and that's the rest. These funds were intended to help bridge the gaps that was created instead of how we are in place with plans to put that aside so we can function. Because it's a legislature. So the risk aversion is going to be challenged pretty significantly by our charge to do what's best for our students and children. Quite frankly, this is where we're at. And also we have staff that if they're not getting any salary increase, it's basically a pay cut based on its cost of living.
About 5%.
And that's untenable. Yeah, I'm looking at this and I'm trying to, the ESSER fund, if we did shift them, I know it is better in your district. What would that look like if we did shift them? How can we move forward with the budget that shift funds to?
Yeah. That's, and I've seen lots of board nods so far, so I think you guys are going to be able to kind of follow what's been in my mind for the last 2 months. We have a variety of meetings here, and they're not perfectly interconnected, and I wish there was a perfect timeline that everyone could follow in terms of what was happening. So we do have the ESSER funding that way, and I was excited to share this initial budget with you. We can certainly take some feedback tonight. There's a step in there that we do at least have to go through the community input process and make sure that we're informed around what our actual recommendations are. I'm not convinced we're getting feedback that would help us to do a whole bunch of funding around if I can continue to kind of give my elevator speech on kind of how we're spending the money, because it's supplanting existing things. So that's in the mix. We've got this interplay between additional staff and staff compensation and a collective bargaining that has to happen behind the scenes. And should not happen on the board stage until we're ready to present the potential past contract. So that's in the mix as well. And then we have the possibility of some additional activities that we get ahead, but we wouldn't be able to do that. We get ahead of a little bit more fun as far as the ESSER meeting. So my best answer to you there would be, I think in the simplest form, I think the board would need to understand that every dollar we move out of the 23-24 ESSER column, we move to 22-23, we are putting more eggs in the basket of a really good next biennial budget, or more likely the potential of the board voting to go down. And I can tell you there is within the risk averse, if there's a district in the state that has positioned themselves well that ask the community for additional spending authority in 2010, with being more rate neutral if it's the Illinois area school district. and we put ourselves in a position that we can tell the story to our community, and ask for additional spending authority, not taxing authority, spending authority from our community. We understand it's the goal of the current board, to keep them really neutral, and manage our budget fiscally responsibly moving forward. The gamble is potentially a little less than some other districts that if they pushed all of their extra funds in, would have to have operating revenue with a tax increase. Because they haven't built into the budget the flexibility to prepaying that on the fund for and they would flat out say, we're going to be $4 million short in 24, 25. And if we go to a fund 10 operating revenue, it would be a pretty decent increase in taxes because they haven't built the flexibility into the budget to manage that.
It makes sense, and I think as we, been going through the budget over the years of the board, and it has been this process, and I think it's because of we don't know what's coming around the corner, every budget. Well, this came around, so this is the rainy day that we have been preparing for, and I'm happy that we're in positions that we can move forward in a way that doesn't impact the tax base. There's no reason. I would love to see what it would look like for the benefit. If we can move ESSER funds to be used next year, so that we can actually pay some of the, I'm looking at 233 years of experience that retired. That's a loss, it's a huge loss to our district. I'm also looking at people that could be retiring next year, and are we really going to tell them? We can't offer any even possibility. That's just that.
Understood. I'm certainly interested in other board feedback as far as this goes, but this was our first draft. And I think we can work with both of you, Dr. Clarity, to get that in a very near future, but with potentially a couple of different scenarios that we could
Jay, just really quickly, and our president was very humble when she talked about the fiscal responsibility of preparation for a rainy day. And the unique position of running a school district is because it's not a rain storm. And that's the situation. So there was a multitude of rainy days in preparation for this moment. And we are very thankful that this board and previous boards have put us in a position where while we know the nation with inflation and things that are having an impact on homes, that there is the possibility of asking a question that allows for a neutral budget impact on households. So it's going to develop like Mary said, it just really reinforce, how important it was to be fiscally responsible for a number of decades.
Can I ask a question that I don't want to jump us too far ahead, but it seems like we're implying something that I just want to make sure I'm understanding and be clear about. If we do have a successful operating referendum, we can use the ESSER funds in the way that they were intended to be used to address learning loss related to the pandemic. Is that right?
For this upcoming school year, we made a change to some of the assumptions that we shared with you at kind of our first initial draft in terms of what the debt schedule would look like. That is potentially true after the 23, 24 fiscal cycle. But we've got a lot of work to do over the next 3 or 4 months in terms of what that final referendum has to be. So Joe, there's certainly the possibility of even bumping up some of the additional operational authority. The number we end up with, in my mind, won't end up at 443 this month. That was our first initial take of this. So if we decided we were going to push a little bit more ESSER funding towards this upcoming school year, and then we also said, you know what? We'd also like $1 million in 23, 24 to do one-night stuff that's good for kids. And we could backfill that with a little bit more operating as possible. There's a little bit more flexibility built into what we shared with you with 4432. But every little additional bit of money we spend from now gives us a little less flexibility for if we have to go to school in 5 or 7 years and what the rate effect is like. So what we initially built for you was actually using the ESSER funding as part of a revenue source, just because we wanted to have the timeline also a long-range capital.
And that makes sense. But this line item schedule that we're looking at now would change, would change if, with a successful.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
So we, the numbers we built in, and I'd have to pull the slide out, but I think Pete and I did build in the federal funding as a base revenue source to offset that. But again, if we want to have that conversation, we do have to, we got a little money left in our Norway. We're still doing prepaying on that for Fund 39 to the tune of $3 or $4 million, even with the potential past operating referendum. So we have to let them have to work a little bit, and less prepaying, maybe like 139 now, maybe when we have to spend later, and we don't pay it as quickly.
That makes sense.
So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about some of these items, but before I do that, it just occurs to me when we're talking about, like Dr. Fairley referred to the conference that he went to, when we're talking about how ESSER funds are intended to be used. I think we can't overstate, because I think with the community sometimes, it's just really frustrating that other states, for example, can use the ESSER funds to make up the learning loss, to mitigate some of the effects of the pandemic. And I just want to reiterate that it's not because Wisconsin school districts were in any way irresponsible, we don't get to use ESSER funds for that purpose. It really comes down to state level decisions about whether per pupil increases should happen or not. It is unusual to have a zero, I don't know if you can get any circumstances. It's unusual to have a $0 per pupil increase, and we happen to have that as a moment in history where we have very high CPI. And that's no fault of any district, and I just want people to understand, it doesn't have to do with anything. I mean, Borough's been very responsible, in my opinion, fiscally, but those state level decisions are not something we can affect. And we would much prefer to use the ESSER funds the way they're intended, not to supplant, existing things we're doing. So that, just to air that, it's worth emphasizing. But when I'm looking at these line items, for example, like the online learning platforms, that's not something that we had spent as much on in the past, like prior to the pandemic. So if you have any thoughts about whether any of these could possibly, there would be a reduction in need, given the fact, like, we didn't use Edgenearly or Edgeseer in the past, because we didn't have as much need for, online learning platforms prior to the pandemic. I don't know if there's anything else on here like that, but any, like hotspots, for example, there still would be students probably with technology issues, but I'm sure that the hotspot, the need for them was really exacerbated by the pandemic. So I don't know if any of these line items, when you figure these numbers, did you figure out if the pandemic is on the downswing? Did you not think the numbers change?
Yeah, excellent question. We did take that into account. In particular, you can see that we cut the hotspot budget almost in half. We also have to, there are still homegrown students that may be out due to COVID that we will send home with a hotspot. We still have some remote learners that are on hotspots as well. So we did take that budget down. Is it potentially a touch on the high side? Yes, but it's also part of our total all-in technology budget. So again, we're supplanting revenues. So even if hotspots only came in at $70,000 this upcoming year, we're actually building balanced budgets behind the scenes that potentially this, when it comes out in the wash, won't be perfect, but it's going to be reasonably close. We did the exact same thing with the online platform, where we set aside $500,000 of ESSER 2 money. That we got close to that, but didn't get there, and cut that pretty drastically for the upcoming school year. But again, we're also doing our best to offer a little bit of insurance policy, fingers crossed, but if some type of different version of COVID-19 pops up and we get G7, we also want to make sure we're budgeting for having that. We're still in the pandemic, we're still in masks. on board speaking.
Thank you for that.
I just have a question. I'm gonna pass on all the unconstructive things that I want to say about our state government. But I would echo Christina's comments that, you know, we're in a very fortunate position because of how we've managed our capital money, Fund 30 money in the past, which is what that question is going to be about. I don't think that I would use the rainy day analogy. The way I think about this is that our state politicians gambled 2 years ago with inflation, and they lost that bet, and now we have to pay it along with every other school district in the state, and that pisses me off. And I can only listen to so much conversation. Anyway, my question is about Fund 30 versus Fund 10, because I want this to be very simple for people to understand. The school district, it seems to me, has two big pots that it puts its revenue in. Fund 30 for capital expenses and Fund 10 for operating expenses. When we ask for money in a referendum, we have to either ask for capital or operating, and we can only spend it on that. So the reason that we're in a good place and can ask for a budget neutral or a tax neutral referendum is because we have to ask for permission to spend money that we might have in Fund 30, since we've done such a good job with it, for Fund 10, which we have to cover because our state government is bad at gambling. Is that a pretty apt summary?
That is an incredibly accurate summary. So the additional revenue authority that the board was given through Fund 39 when you passed the capital referendum, the taxpayers trusted you to essentially pay down a nearly $200 million home and do so responsibly, and gave you taxing permission to pay off essentially that mortgage. And you are exactly right. If we went to operating referendum, you just would be asking for new permission to manage Fund 39 and Fund 10. The vote, the potential referendum vote would be simply giving the board, just as you said, the ability instead of putting money towards capital debt, putting it towards people. And doing so, if we keep the current strategy in a way that we're not asking for additional taxing dollars from our constituents, we're simply asking for permission to, instead of using the permission you already gave us in Fund 39, you're giving us new permission to do it in Fund 10.
So then if the community decides through their feedback sessions that they actually would like to do some learning recovery, which is what SAT is meant for, then we might be asking for new funds.
If we headed in the direction by the time we get to July, that is correct, that there's obviously a scenario that instead of that being a $13 million number, it's 15 or 17 million, that once we start to bump towards 15 million-ish, we're heading in a direction where we would require, we'd be making more minimum payments on Fund 39. And once you start bumping into, that 15, 17 million number, we need additional revenues from Fund 10, which would result in an increase. That is correct. And I'll continue to take the board back to this, and I'll have a report to you probably sometime in the month of April. And this will have to be part of our strategy in the long community input sessions. We want to be perfectly transparent with all the members of our community, and also the long range needs in our district, in that we don't want to, we wouldn't want to, because we could potentially really push on the operating tax, make minimum payments on Fund 39, no more prepayment, and push that number very high and still have a more neutral referendum. But then what happens if we need a $45 million elementary school in 5 years? Then we have a referendum that's with a pretty substantial tax increase. And those conversations get a lot more difficult. You guys were just here 3 years ago and we gave you all this new spending authority, and now you're here asking for an elementary school. Did you see this coming? And as a board and as an administrative staff, we are going to be very transparent with the community around the long range needs of the district and how we work in the future needs of the school. So that's in the mix as well.
To John's question, we're going to be putting both of those options in front of the community to get their feedback in your discovery sessions of, hey, here's what it looks like, to John's point, if you actually want to make up the learning gaps, which by the way still exist, and we haven't been able to make up, here's what more text that there's going to be. No.
Absolutely. So I think unless there are other questions around ESSER, John, I think this is actually a perfect segue to an update on what's going on. I think these would be the exact type of discussions we'll have with the referendum committee when we're drafting potential feedback questions that we gather from folks when we're meeting with them.
Okay, I do have one more question. And I feel like my role as treasurer is like her cat. So everybody says something and then I put it all together and figure out how we move forward. So you've shown us, I have like old budget stuff and everything all over the place here, but in my mind it's working. You showed us in one of our budget meetings kind of what it would look like if we had some ESSER in 2023, some in 2024, and then that 4432. So could you show us something or bring back something for the board to see if we brought a little bit more ESSER over? I think to Joe's point, what would those other numbers start to look like as we start to do stuff? I know that we've done, and we keep talking about it, an amazing job at investing in our buildings, but what does it look like for us to truly invest in our people as well? And we've all seen and experienced the impact of inflation. And, you know, although we don't have the budget to do quite as much as what is necessary right now, is there something we can do to support our staff? Just what could that look like if we got closer to, I mean, you have a step plus 1% is the 1.2. We have the 0.2, but if we move over $1 million, like, can you start to show us that scenario and what that would look like for mill rate, or, you know, are we getting closer to that $14 million range and just seeing those pieces?
Absolutely. That's why we've got this guy on board. So we'll put. I know you're looking forward to refreshing that spreadsheet again. That's
That sounds like
absolutely
more
not.
meetings on my part.
It is why we're
but-
here. That's a very good summary and certainly a takeaway from this portion of the presentation.
Thank you.
You bet. All right. We almost made it. We've made it through 2/3 of the finance update. I think we can be relatively short here. So to update the board again, at our last major update regarding the referendum, clarity, and then Meredith both agreed that it would be a good idea for us to have an operating referendum committee. And we've met several times between our last board meeting and tonight, and we've promised the board periodic updates in terms of what's happening with that committee and progress relative to the draft timeline we shared with the board. I did want the board to note that the committee was actually agreed. It's almost like it was written before we even knew all of this was coming. That the purpose of this committee aligned perfectly with COVID-19. Which says assure the timely flow of information, appropriate input, strategic two-way communication between the district and the public that builds an understanding and support of district efforts. And I think that is the idea behind the board, kind of the in-between with the referendum committee, and then the work we'll be doing with our community to make sure that they're informed and can give us feedback on what they're doing. I wanted to make sure the board saw that this has been kind of a draft we have shared with the referendum committee each time. We have agreed on kind of the following ideas around the why and the purpose of our group getting together. That it's going to be really important that we inform and participate in community engagement down the road, and this will become a piece of that, and this will be a responsibility of the board and certainly the committee members, will be to understand the financial background in this story. That we should get to a spot that we can have a 3-minute conversation around our strategy heading into this summer, but also if there are follow-up questions from the community that require a little bit more detailed answer, I feel like this whole team is in a spot where we start to have these conversations. And certainly members of the referendum committee should be there. We want to assist in planning the messaging. We want to make sure we understand the long-range plan in terms of enrollment as it's related to this shorter-term need for the district. This committee will continue to provide periodic updates to the board, and then following potential board vote, I certainly think the committee, the board as a whole, will play a big role in the community information sharing if we had an update into a spot everybody later on this summer. Again, this is just a reminder to the board in terms of our projected timeline, which will allow this to work. We're sitting at that first update we made, and we will continue to work with the referendum committee as we track towards really that next chunk of work, which will be community input, potentially polling, information sharing that will take place towards the end of March and April. We will continue to bring through that update back to the board in terms of information in our community. We've got a busy 6 weeks to 8 weeks from May to June to continue to touch up potential numbers, even related to some of the questions that Joe asked tonight around finally getting to a spot where we're comfortable with potential vote, and that will be on the lower on the docket potentially for a July vote. Things continue to progress the way they are. We will be kind of a key cog in making sure this continues to move along. Additionally, we don't spend a ton of time on this tonight, but we included it in board docs and board materials. I didn't screenshot the entire roadmap to July, but we have worked with our referendum committee, getting feedback on some of the key pieces that will happen on our way to July. The big chunks that you'll see in the roadmap that we included in board docs are relative to what the board already knows. So we already kind of put this in place in terms of what our challenges are relative to the need for an operating referendum and some key talking points that we may use as we're informing the community. That roadmap to July, in my mind, really has a few key pieces. So one key piece is making sure we've got the right information to share with the public. The second piece is making sure we're asking the right questions and gaining the right feedback when we're talking to the public and interacting with the board. And then we're making sure that we've got two-way communication with the right information and asking the right questions, and that the full board is informed as we're heading to July. So that's really the work that's ahead of us over the next few months. If we end up in probably we will in July.
Can I make a quick comment on these talking points? I know this isn't our communication plan itself, but I'd like us to keep this in mind as we consider our communication plan. In the fourth bullet point down, we say down here, operational referendum funds to be used to increase compensation for teachers and staff. I prefer to think of it as what we're trying to do is avoid compensation cuts rather than giving increases, because that seems more like we're just deciding on a discretionary basis, we think teachers should be paid more, so we're going to pay more, and that's why we're doing this ask. I wish we were having that discussion, but what we're actually talking about is having to do this just to keep level, just to keep our teachers' heads above water. So I think we just need to always think about when we message this, we message it in a way that shows this is just to keep them from getting a pay cut rather than we want to give them more.
And it's, in my mind, to add to that, Joe, and I won't be concerned about this, to avoid compensation increases or cuts relative to the cost.
Exactly. That's 100% true, because that's the message we have to get out there, that if you're not giving the normal increases that we do to keep up with inflation, for all intents and purposes, that is a pay cut. Yes.
That is exactly why I'm sharing this with the board tonight. That's really the feedback from you. Anything else on this?
I do have a random question, and I appreciate all the discussion, by the way, everyone. I'm finding myself to be quite a processor at this table sometimes, and I just appreciate to be able to process along with bigger questions that are being asked. And just my bit of understanding of referendums being recurring or not recurring, I'm curious about the 4-year recurring. Could you just tell me more about that defined timeframe?
The 4-year recurring referendum that is converted around increased spending authority or taxing authority, at least on the initial draft scenario I shared with you, that was go 4 and an additional 4, which means that we're doing an additional essentially $8 million that we stacked it on. 3 and 2. So that's 4-year return. Once that time's out, you build $13 million into your base taxing authority, and then stage tax. A non-recurring referendum, if you ask for a one-time lump of $4 million, it means you got by for a year, the following year, you're sitting on a $4 million. So in some districts, that is the strategy they potentially take. It's not one we've recommended to the board because of the position we're in for the long-term planning relative to compensating and hiring related professionals. But some districts go to the and say, can you give us $200 1 year to get us out of this pinch in the form of a temporary mill rate adjustment, and then it will go away. And if we need it again, we'll come back and ask again. And some districts find themselves on the route where they are going to do non-recurring referendums for the 2 or 4 years. And then you can't get referendum inclusion, and we are in a spot that I don't believe that that's a strategy that is very possible. Because we position ourselves to recurring, strict recurring spending.
One of the values that we have because we have gone through the budgeting process in the past was to make sure that we're respecting our constituents and taxpayers in the way that they would plan. We don't have surprise tax bills. We want to be sure that, we're providing as much consistency as possible in this type of reporting referendum is true to that. The respectful that our taxpayers that they can plan for what their tax bill would look like based on our
And just to be clear, we are asking for permission. If for whatever reason the state decides we're just gonna give you all this money and do what you need to do with it, we may not need to use that permission, but we have to ask for it in order to, if we do need it. So it's us asking our communities for permission if we need it,
That is exactly.
which right now we do need it, but.
So, yeah, and we've been conservative on those long range, 5-year projections that we get another $100 in the state of Wisconsin, per people. And if we ended up with 200, 250 in the next 5-year budget, the board would have additional taxing authority to increase numbers. You guys already have it in the form of funds already, and you haven't leveraged it and paying taxes in the school district. So you are exactly right. There's a possibility that if the budget comes in really good, and there's a number of variables that we show the board 2 years down the road, and we have an additional $3 million spending authority, and we take a look at the bottom line and try to keep no rates somewhere between $12.75 and $13, like we have for the last decade. But you might say, we don't need all $3 million because we can give an additional taxing authority in the state of Wisconsin, and we don't need the revenue taxing authority to make the bottom line. You're exactly right. All right, we're getting close to the end. Anybody has anything else there? Super brief staff update. I just asked Michelle to put together a slide just to make sure the board was in the loop in terms of what the next couple of months would look like. So we have worked our way through all the things we discussed with the board in terms of the month of February, the staffing workbooks being released and finalized, and Dr. Hawkins and her team are working very closely with human resources to make sure we've got the right team in the right spots in our schools. And we released the first ever mass posting in the history of the Illinois School District very early with the idea of staying some spring graduates and making sure that we were the first ones on LinkedIn and Indeed and everywhere else to make sure we had to try to get folks who were interested in applying to our district. So that happened in March. And now we are working, Pete's working behind the scenes right now to work through building-based staffing plans and allocation relative to building-based budgets. We will, down the road here in August, continue to kind of manage because they're not on the July fiscal year. If we have hourly retirements or the hiring that will be ongoing, or teacher contracts will be remain. And teacher contracts will release the name to back to the shelf. So things are tracking very well in terms of what we should do for the and that's it. So I have for I want to thank all of you. I've got very clear takeaways from the information I shared tonight. We will probably be seeing us very shortly. Thank you guys.
So Kevin, before you go, if there's a action to approve the budget amendments, that correct? Should we move to that or we?
Yes, so I would, first thing be Jeff, she mentioned for very clear, and I'm very appreciative of the details that you provided. It's about close the superintendent's report, and it's time to get
Thank you so much. This is a lot of information for us. A lot.
Thank you guys for being with us.
always. Madam President, do we do the board action today? Before BSC.
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we have to do, to approve the amendment that was, described by Kevin, he's very, motion, if there's a motion to, accept the, amendment as presented.
I move that we accept accept the budget amendment as presented by the motion.
Thank you, a motion from Ann, do I have a second?
Second.
A second from Joe, all in favor, signify with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion has passed. Thank you, everybody. At this time, we will take a 5-minute recess, and we'll be back here to into our results and operating policies. Okay, 5 minutes.
question. Just to the board, we were doing policy interpretation, we're focusing on the reasonableness of the interpretation, whether or not it demonstrates the understanding of the board's underlying values. And when we're looking at the indicators and performance targets, we're looking at to ensure that they're measurable and that they will help us determine whether reasonable progress has been made. So I am going to turn it over to Clarity and Dr. Hawkins and.
All right, good evening, everyone, again. We get to move into our part, student outcomes, and I know Dr. Hawkins, who is highly competitive, wants to make sure that her presentation comes up just like business services. So. We're all working on behalf of kids. So as we go into results policy, and this time we're going to embrace 2.1.3, which is specifically for science. This is where you're going to see a drastic switch from what you've seen before. The reason being, the first two times we were able to work explicitly around the metrics and our and assessments of how we would actually know results. We cannot yet, and I'm going to say yet, do that when it comes to science. And so this will be a presentation of the results policy where, per our governance model, we were going to talk specifically around capacity building. And the results policy will allow us to build the capacity to get to the level of metrics and assessing of student performance. And then have that, those measures presented to the Board of Education once the capacity is built. So obviously, you'll see a timeline as part of this, of how long it should take us to build the capacity to reach those results. I'm just going to pause there so that maybe my question why you saw it shows you a distinct difference between what you saw in science and what you saw in university. So with
Is
that,
there any background just for the community's sake as to why we don't have similar metrics? You know, I think we've had some background discussions to have some training for that, but maybe that would be helpful to get an understanding why.
absolutely, and that document that's part of that. And we're also we're very respectful of previous administrations, and we're trying to talk about our stance on it. We're looking at it as opportunities to grow and meet a new level of expectations based on policies. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hawkins to walk us through the results policy. Sure. Okay.
So good evening, everyone. I will say it was exciting the last time I spoke to you all, and we told you to, be on the lookout for our STAR results. So you've heard that, so we are especially proud of that. Thank you all for your support. But tonight we're going to talk about science. And so when we think about science, we'll open up with our beliefs. Each student will be literate and numerate, able to achieve their personalized goals. Accordingly, each student will achieve at individually and appropriately challenging levels and acquire academic competencies in the following disciplines. And so this one is specifically talking about science. And so our point 2.13, the interpretation of this, the VASD Board of Education values student learning and achievement that meets or exceeds grade level standards as well as goal setting as a cornerstone of teaching and learning. The Board of Education expects that all students to learn science concepts that are rich in both content and practice and arranged in a coherent manner across disciplines and grades. And so the interpretation of this says each student is pre-K, kindergarten through 12th grade, and special education 18 to 21. And so just a little background, several years ago, site-based, schools were able to make decisions about which curriculum they would use. Some schools would make a decision to focus primarily on mathematics and English language arts, and science and social studies may have taken backseat. So not that it wasn't taught, it may not have been taught to the level that we would like to see it be taught moving forward. So when we think about our indicators, since this policy is about capacity building, we don't have any indicators. Our indicators will be the metrics that we use down in the timeline that it takes for us to adopt a new science curriculum. So you'll see the definition of terms. You'll see education terms. Now, in our definition of terms, those terms are very similar to what you saw in math and English language arts. But in our education terms, we focus on science terms. So you'll see natural science, earth science, the four sciences, so the four branches of science. And these are defined. And then we also wanted to pay particular attention to engineering, technology, and science application. And so that is particular to study of engineering, computer, and digital concepts. So when we go to the superintendent's indicators, this is about capacity building. And so what you will see, that in order for us to monitor and report student results for science, it is necessary for us to select and adopt a comprehensive K-12 science curriculum, and to then develop a program of science instruction that produces high achievement for all students. So our timeline includes an adoption cycle that begins the 22-23 school year and includes the following. So we'll select an adoption team. And so this team will be comprised of all stakeholders, parents, teachers, students. We certainly want to include student voice. What do students want to, what do students want in instruction? What do they want to see? And so we're really going to make sure we include their voice. We will then identify science materials. So we will seek out and bring in multiple vendors. Then we will pick groups and schools to pilot the materials. We will review and collect feedback from our teachers, from our students, and our staff. We will then ultimately make a decision on which science materials we're going to purchase and use. And then we will begin the implementation phase. And so that will begin the 23-24 school year. When we think about what's going to guide our work, as we're looking at a science curriculum, we're looking for a science curriculum. Here are just a few questions that we're going to use as we're seeking out and looking at materials. Are materials designed for the next generation science standards? So those are the standards that we use. Will the materials work for remote or hybrid learning? We saw a few years ago, we had to pivot to online learning in a virtual environment. And so we want to make sure that the materials that we purchase allow us to continue to work either asynchronously, synchronously, and just have a continuous plan for learning. How well do the materials support diverse learners? We want to make sure that our materials are culturally responsive and relevant. We also want to make sure that our materials complement our instructional plan for science. We also want to make sure that our materials support and enhance and complement our current math and English language arts curriculum. So those are just a few questions. That is not an all-inclusive list of considerations that we will use as we begin this process. Again, we will then spend a great deal of time on professional development. Interestingly enough, all of our students enjoy science in some way, shape, or form, but oftentimes our teachers feel inept or don't feel as comfortable teaching science as they do math and ELA. So we want to make sure that we give considerable consideration to professional development to help our teachers feel extremely comfortable teaching science and incorporating science into the classroom. The anticipated cost on the extremely high end is less than $200K, and this would include the curriculum, the materials, and the teacher professional development that will go along with this. That is the results policy. Knowing that once we do this work, we'll then begin to move into a phase where we will use assessments to have actual results to share with you. But our first step is identifying a curriculum and implementing it. That being said, I'll turn it back over to you, Madam President.
Okay, well, board, is there any questions that you have for Dr. Hawkins about the nuts and bolts or clarifying questions? And at this point, this would be a great time you can ask about capacity, but we do not vote to improve capacity building, but it's a great time to just put any questions there. Tom?
Yeah, I just had some questions around capacity, and I will preface this by saying that I am usually very antagonistic towards curriculum-based approaches like this. So that's my bias, I'm just throwing it out there. But I'm curious about making sure that we leverage the teachers that we have that do a very good job incorporating science into the programs. That's the first part of my question, so if you can speak to that a little bit. Because I've always had tremendous experiences with science-oriented teachers at all grades levels in the district here. And I understand the need for curriculums, I'm not discussing that. But the second thing is, when you're thinking about criteria for selection, how much would you think about how well it interfaces with a more of a project-based environment, as opposed to just lessons, worksheets, glad you're in there, that sort of thing. If you could just speak to those two things, that'd be great.
So to respond to your first question or your first comment, yes, we do have some teachers that do an exceptionally good job at incorporating science. But then we have some, it's not because they can't or don't, it's because the material, the resources, just the learning and the understanding of science, they don't feel as comfortable doing so. So having a curriculum with resources does allow them to tap into materials that are created and then to put their touch or to use data to personalize it to the students that they have. So I don't want to discount any of our teachers that are doing an amazing job teaching science. And you will see that especially at the middle and the high school where the teachers create, they develop curriculum, they write it, they create the assessment. The challenge though becomes when you have teachers creating assessments, this teacher creates this assessment, this teacher creates this assessment, and then when we're looking for results, this teacher has this assessment, this teacher has this assessment, and we're not able to get an accurate picture of what our students are doing and learning. To speak to your second point, yes, to have hands-on science is exactly what we're looking for. Worksheets don't really capture science. So we know that in order to capture the interest of our students, it has to involve hands-on, it has to be engaging. You will find that now to some degree, we're using mystery science K-5, and it was actually a supplemental program that was designed that we are now using. It's not a K-5 comprehensive curriculum, but there are units where students have experiments and teachers use the videos, they watch the video, and then students will participate in the experiment. So to respond to your statement, yes, we realize that it must be highly engaging. Reading about science isn't doing science. And so we want our students to really fully engage in it. They have to do it. They have to be fully immersed in it. So yes, that is definitely a consideration.
If I could, yeah. Sure.
Yep.
If I can add to this a little bit, and I'll be very transparent because Dr. Hawkins is probably going to get very sick of us. I mean, I'm a former middle school science teacher, and then she's also dealing with a assistant superintendent for business services who was a science teacher at high school. So we're constantly buzzing in her ear about, and she's like, I got it this long. Just want to put that out.
Or something is extended to better.
Absolutely. And so the things that, to your point, John, that we are explicitly thinking about when it comes to science, and if I wasn't loving the superintendent, I'd be doing forces in motion all day. In that world. But what we're trying to accomplish is really to intersectionality of the content. So as doctors, science as a subject, but we also know science lives in every subject matter that we have. And so we're looking for a partner, and within your real estate partner, understand what true intersectionality means. We're also looking for very creative, innovative methods of both instruction and for how the student receives it. If a partner in science cannot work with us and clearly identify that some traditional methods have natural gender biases within them, then they are not the right partner in our work. And so those are the things that we're intentionally going deeper into to understand. And there's the standard, but we're talking about the delivery, we're talking about the institution experience, we're talking about a non-traditional manner of student engagement that doesn't duplicate systems where the biases have developed, and we see those gaps graduating themselves at the high school level where there's fewer people are female students. So those are just some of the examples of how we want to go on this. And it has to be aligned to what would be our really creative vision for spending the rest of our.
Is it safe to assume, based on your enthusiasm, that there's going to be years that there are updates throughout the year as the adoption process is underway?
Absolutely, and I am going to do my best to stay at our expert doing that, but I was just thinking that there'll be quite a lot of advice on.
So I have a quick question, and I am a scientist as well, so this is exciting for me. So you mentioned here that our implementation will start to look at some metrics in 2023-24 school year. So I know that our students are doing science now. So if I was a parent, what kind of information could you give me about this interim space we're kind of in? Just realizing like where we are and where we want to be. What would you tell me as a parent to not have me feel like, why is my kid taking science and there's not good science, right? Like, I know that's not true, but how can we explain that to our community in a way that makes sense?
So currently in elementary, we are using something called mystery science. And so what we have found is that without the professional development, many of our teachers are some teachers are using experiments and assessments. Some people are using worksheets. So science is being taught. It is just not at the level, a consistent level across all schools. To speak to middle and high school, I think teachers write courses or develop curriculum. And so again, for us to be able to look across all of our seventh graders and say, here is a measure that we can safely say that all of our students have mastered all of these standards with certainty, that's a little difficult for us to do because every teacher, every course has been written by each teacher. So I feel very comfortable saying that students are learning science. We just don't have a good gauge to measure science across our district.
Thank you. My question kind of builds on that. I'm just wondering, since we do have some programs, for example, one of our elementary charters, there's STEM focus. So maybe this is a question for, further down this path of curriculum selection, but I'm just wondering how the indicators will keep that into account. The fact that there is a school that has more of a center in STEM. And then similarly, you mentioned one of the questions you would be asking during the curriculum selection process is there diverse learners and how does the curriculum address that? So being a tweet parent myself, I know that there are certain grade levels, for example, in middle school, where the Spanish content course is science. So they're learning science, but they're learning in Spanish at certain grade levels. So I'm just wondering again, how the indicators, will they have to vary for the students that are in programs like in New Century or perhaps in Tweed, or how the indicators will take into account that the students experience different when they're in the programs?
That is a good question. And at this point, I'm reluctant and hesitant to even delve into what the indicators might look like until we get to that point.
Go ahead.
I feel like I've opened a can of worms here, and I just want to be perfectly. No, I'm just trying to check. I don't want any more updates. I'm greatly enthusiastic. really appreciate that this is not a board decision or discussion. My only concern with the questioning is that, you know, I want to respect the teacher autonomy, especially the teachers that have expertise in the district, and make sure that that's out there. And I echo what Christine said, that we have long tenured teachers at New Century that have been taking middle school science and applying it in an elementary environment through Project Equally, which aligns with our high school, and they have some expertise there. I'm sure you're very much on top of it, and I don't expect to hear about this until we have indicators, because that's my job. So I'm still not on this side.
I have a much plainer question.
Duly noted.
So the February 7th board meeting, we were presented on the additive piece slide, essentially that we were going to reduce the number of hours in curriculum planning. And clearly this is a new area where we're identifying, hey, we need to really establish some consistent curriculum. So can you kind of just address, like, is the increase, the 10% decrease in comparison to the past 2 years of curriculum hours, is that not going to affect this effort? Because I want to make sure we're not holding you to something over here and then binding your hands over here when you've identified this real need to invest in it.
So we have curriculum hours where teachers spend time developing curriculum.
Yeah.
And so then we will also have hours that will be allotted to professional development. I will say that when you think about developing curriculum, if you have to start from scratch, it's a lot more work. So we envision that we're giving you tools and resources that are going to keep you from having to start from scratch, which will then reduce the curriculum hours a lot.
I just really appreciate this work, because I've been in so many conversations where, you know, we all believe that we're good at something. And I think this is one of those areas where we, as a community, believe that we're really good, and we are. I'm just not sure we can do that. And this is great.
I think it's a good point. We started this conversation off by saying there's been a new director to the administration for the policies, so this is not what we're saying. We created the policies to demonstrate achievements through science. So this is very, very helpful. Are there any other questions here?
I'm curious, you brought up the point, I apologize for not getting your exact phrasing, but basically addressing the fact that because math and English language arts have gotten surfaced so highly, and that's literally impacted schedules in our buildings. How do you see what that may look like potentially with science? Because I know you made the comment that we want to try to bring in a curriculum that blends with our schedule, but I also wonder about shifts to the schedule to be able to enhance the science programming.
So there will be some work. Our directors are going to work with our schools to craft and carve out time that's allotted to science and social studies, but particularly science. But as Dr. Clarity mentioned, we really want for science and social studies to dovetail together. So we were at one of our charter schools, and we saw an amazing example of how math was being taught, and science was right here as a complementary lesson where the student was going to be able to use the math skills to determine force and motion and be able to solve and work out some problems as it related to the science experiment they were working on. That's ultimately the goal. I do know that, as a former fourth and fifth grade teacher, when I had an opportunity to teach what I wanted, I would teach the things that I enjoyed. And so sometimes I didn't teach science because I focused on this. So there will be some intentional effort so that there is time dedicated in our schedule. But there's some other scheduling constraints that we're working around, common planning time. When we identify and carve out common planning time, then there will be some shifts to the schedule. So there's work to be done, but we're excited that our teachers are ready to embrace this. And more importantly, our students, just what we've seen just visiting the buildings the last few months, our students love and enjoy science. So just that alone is the catalyst for us to find the time to teach science. to explicitly teach science and then marry it with our other subjects. So I don't know if that answers the question, but we do realize that it hasn't always been carved out and teachers have to find the time. We're gonna make sure that it is in the schedule and the time is found for them so that we can dedicate them at that time to science.
Your comments answer the question enough to get me thinking I'm gonna go into John's lane and Dr. Clary's lane of it. My math teacher brain is now just, I'm overloaded. I'll just keep it.
Okay.
Can I quickly, so I just wanted to make sure, that first the board and Dr. Arnold, no one in the space has done any staff or teacher like, but I don't want to come across in this stretch of imagination as well. I want to remember that things are, our current opportunity for growth here are also, kind of evidence of systems that are built. When you think about systems where you are publicly held accountable for language arts and math scores, you are inevitably going to put your time, PD, and teaching into language arts and math scores. And so we are trying to kind of elevate the importance, but also elevate the importance of all of our content areas. And then when Dr. Martin spoke about how important that intersectionality, with the science and math component and then the social studies, language arts, how those are linked together so we can still, we have to understand that a strong scientist will be a strong mathematician if we do it correctly. A strong person in literacy becomes a critical thinker and understands social studies and perspective because of those literacy skills. So we want to make sure that those are come together and, as this team stays together and grows together, we're going to get to the space where I think we kind of need a model. What does that measure look like? How do you identify a strong science math outcome? How do you identify a strong literacy and associated outcome? You have to measure that, right? But those are 4 or 5.
I think that's a huge piece, that we may catch some kids who may not be drawn to math. Science can be the hook for those skills, into that interest rate. So.
And then lastly, I know, John, I appreciate your statement that, you don't want to hear anything until indicators and that's, but with a potential $200,000 price tag, even though that does not reach the limit of board approval, I would feel remiss if we didn't provide updates, because we're not going to have more money for that. So those that will come in those updates, just so you know how we're using our tax dollars.
So to be clear, those are updates to keep us informed and keep our community informed, but it's certainly not action that the board will be taking to approve it, because we have entrusted that shared administration. But keeping us informed is always exciting, especially when there's things to be done on. Are there any other clarifying questions for Dr. Hawkins at this time? Okay, so hearing none, this is when we have received and discussed the superintendent's interpretation and capacity building. At this time, we'll accept the motion. I'll take the motion to accept and approve the interpretations. And the interpretation only, because the capacity building is not subject to board approval, and we'll hold on the figures. But I'll accept the motion to approve the interpretation. If that's it, hold. All right, motion from Nicole, wait a second. A second from John. Okay, so at this time, we can discuss the interpretation to ensure that the interpretation captures the board's intentions in setting up this policy. And I will say, I appreciate the laying out of the capacity building, even though it's not simply for the board's approval, it certainly helps us see what's to come, and it's definitely worth explaining why we need to have capacity building. There is a history of a site-based model that we've been that has continued to maybe hinder our district-wide approach to evaluating.
Yeah, I think this also helps us, to my question as a parent, my kid has X teacher in 7th grade and has Y teacher in 8th grade, and they're teaching different. And it doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other, but it's just different. And so why is it different? And being able to explain to our parents why those differences exist and what we're doing to ensure that we do have something that is cohesive across our entire district. Really helps with explaining, here's what we're doing to ensure that we are providing that world-class education.
I was just gonna add that, with the indicators, I was worried, but I found it interesting that engineering, technology, and science, that the tech was included in here because we have a separate results policy for that. But rereading that, I think it was appropriate to add it back in here, so I was very happy, even though we didn't really call that out as specific science. I was super happy to see that as well.
Any other comments about the interpretation? Okay, hearing none. Anybody to approve this as board? Okay, all in favor of approving the interpretation as presented, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The interpretation has passed. Thank you very much, board. Thank you, Dr. Hopkins. We appreciate the presentation.
Thank you, obviously. Phenomenal job.
Sorry?
Phenomenal.
Oh, social studies.
Okay, so, as we double book tonight with our policies, we have operational expectation monitoring, so it will be 7 to review tonight. Again, reasonable standard, but I am going to turn it over to Dr. Clarity, and I think this Chad, you're just tonight. Okay, so I will turn it over to Dr. Clarity and his team to go through both the 7 for us. I'm pretty ready.
Absolutely. So thank you again, and I'm going to respectfully ask that you shift your brains down, because now we're moving out of the results world back into our operations world. Is it fair to say, I think Davis was there, saw that the excitement and enthusiasm for science may not be as evident. You know what I'm saying? Just because these are, we get back into the more technical aspects of how they work. And really, I think it's moved from a struggle to a grapple to, I think we're trying to get better at is this fine line between indicator and process. Yeah, and just be very transparent that it's not an easy journey, because as we're looking at not showing you the action in process world, and what exactly are you showing? As proof. So we will continue to try to get better at this. We just want to name that journey that we're on in terms of our processes and get to the role of indicators. So you had OE7 for quite some time. We delayed it. As me, so Ken, you want to do a quick overview of the policy, and then we'll jump right into
Absolutely, Dr. Clarity, and I did want to echo your point that in some of the things that we'll review tonight, as far as kind of the subparts of this policy, it's very easy to be process oriented, and we can find ourselves heading down a rabbit hole on occasion in terms of trying to come up with true measurements and indicators that aren't directly connected to what is process, in some cases just best practice. Having an insurance policy that's vetted in the industry standard in place as process E, but also is a non-negotiable as far as Dr. Clarity's work and the work of my team to make sure that the district's assets are protected. So that's Dr. Clarity operates the policy. We think it's pretty clearly outlined that the superintendent will ensure that all district assets are adequately protected, that's the insurance piece, properly maintained, appropriately used, and not placed at undue risk. And the interpretation is that the Vernon Area School District Board of Education values the safeguarding of all the things in the aforementioned statement, properties, assets, interests, and investments of the district. So to Dr. Clarity point, I know this has kind of been on the street here for the last 6 weeks, and many board members have had a chance to review both, all the sub-policies and related indicators. So certainly here to listen to the board discussion and feedback prior to approval.
Thank you, Jen. And as you think about the interpretation, we know we have a board that values our safeguarding of our properties and assets. There should be no reason ever that board members drive around town and see one of our vehicles parked downtown somewhere else. That's what we take that seriously as those as taxpayers' money, that we are accountable to ensuring our in the right place at the right time about what we use, and that in the event of unfortunate accident, things that may happen, that we have appropriate coverage to make sure that our state will so as we will make sure our staff member is safe and that we have an ability to cover that. So that in essence is the interpretation of the assets, interests, and investments of the district. And now we're going to turn it over to our board president to begin the discussion of is that interpretation correct? And then as you go to the indicators, have we been able to navigate the process and give you true indicators that are not a special process?
So now we time for board has any questions about the content of the policy of the the interpretation of the indicators for Dr. Clarity or Chad to answer those now. These are just clarifying questions.
I do. I'm going to on OB 7.4, I was trying to read through this and suss out just what we're doing as a district to maintain proper technology security policies. And I know we probably don't have like a CISO or someone, a chief security officer, or someone here who's kind of charged with that specific task, but I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to, hopefully this never happens, but should we be held ransom with the data or things like that? Can you talk through, like, does this address that piece, or is that in another policy, or did we as a board not actually sufficiently call that out?
Yes, you get the mark as the interpretation. We are labeling it as the processes for, I should say processes, it's the interpretation of our methodology to ensuring that we are known as 100% secure against ransomware attack, but that we have as many strategies as possible to ensure that our files and our information are kept in a safe manner. We also, I think as we presented, it's been quite a while, a couple months ago, we had to change our processes based off what we learned from some surrounding districts and ransomware attacks, as well as to maintain our insurance status. There were expectations of new strategies that were put in place. So to your long way of saying to your question, yes, that's where it does live in this area. And I don't think there's an issue with the way the board formed this policy, because we interpreted it as those systems to protect our digital information.
Would that be captured in indicator 1 for the possession and recovery plan? That's something we protect that?
So possession and recovery is not the same. It's like an external penetration test or something like that. But I could be speaking for, I don't know what other school districts do. But those are two fundamentally different things. But again, I work for a healthcare data company, so the needs might not be quite the same. I was just wondering kind of what's
On the only piece I would add to that, Dr. Clarity, is that I do think indicator 2 slightly gets to the fact that we are maintaining our own intellectual property. We do have a network specialist and a team, a team managed on the academic service side that's not only doing kind of the preventative work, but also is making sure that, Dr. Clary's point, one of the biggest drivers right now for changes we implemented this year is our ability to re-up cyber security insurance for next year. We fully expect our rates to increase, but it's getting to the point in the school district, and I'm sure you're seeing it in your field, that insurance companies won't touch you unless certain pieces are in place. So even this year, we've integrated multi-factor authentication, which is like a big deal. Even a couple of years ago, and I lived this in the tech services world in Madison, it seemed like there was no way we were ever going to get all 1,000 employees to agree to hand out a cell phone number, send a text message. You guys all know the routine. And teachers' time is so valuable. We try to protect that in some ways to a fault. And we have not done that this year. That we've implemented a number of non-negotiables from an insurance carrier that we will not supply the district insurance unless you have these following checkboxes checked and can prove it when it comes to July 1.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
I was just gonna make a couple comments on 7.4, or questions rather, while we're on it. Chad, you mentioned indicator 2. Is it really true that we don't do any for-profit use of our own IP?
I can think of an instance where we have problems from our technical.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is because that seemed not to be derived off of the policy statement, so I didn't know if there was some separate policy or practice, historical practice here, that even if a for-profit opportunity arose for district-owned IP, that we wouldn't or couldn't profit.
To my understanding is in the determination that the for-profit use actually opens up use more vulnerability, and so intended into another indicator that we are not adding more vulnerability for education.
And my other question on 7.4 was what the reasoning was for setting a dollar amount limit for the definition of fixed assets, not considering original purchase price below $5,000 to be fixed assets subject to that policy. Is there a specific reason for that, or is it just trying to draw lines?
I think, and Dr. Clary, you can follow up. Joe, I think this again gets back to the struggle between process and coming up with measurable ways to define these indicators. So I think at some point that dollar figure had to be, we thought a dollar figure was appropriate for the management of that.
Correct. It has, and not to make it further, but I can't guarantee you that every can pencil that we're laying it down that it's not working out. So we're trying to get to this reasonable space of a dollar amount where we were actually over intentionally measuring that we're not going to just products outside of that. So we said that as kind of our threshold, and we felt like we did prove those assets to you at 5,000. I'm sure you can guarantee that we
Yeah, I mean, we've got 5,000 iPads on the street, and I think our district does an amazing job tracking those assets and the intellectual property that's on them, but it certainly doesn't get to that $5,000.
But I think that raises what I'm kind of asking about. The iPads are exactly what I was thinking. Like an individual iPad isn't going to cost more than $5,000, but on the aggregate, all of our iPads is not pretty significant, but it's a decent line item on our budget. That if the iPads generally are maintained in a way that's insecure or somehow puts them at risk, how are we assessing that? Is it because each individual iPad is below $5,000 that it's not considered a fixed asset? Or is it because on the aggregate, the purchase cost for iPads generally is above $5,000 that would be considered fixed?
Good question, Joe.
So
We originally jumped into the tech, we had a line item recurring utility budget. So it was something that was being reevaluated, the life cycle was every 3 years, is that right? So this was going to be kind of in consistent with the buyback program we have. Right?
You are spot on. I think that other piece that gets a little gray here is that if an iPad is knowingly damaged, We have processes in place that ask families to recoup the district in terms of that asset. And that there are protections put in place on the back end of how students log into our iPads, the single sign-on, what we would allow anyone to be able to access from a student's iPad that would protect that intellectual property. And the safeguards put into place that, all the way down to, having, a third-party software that's even matching for students typing in harmful text and so forth. That these assets are monitored in terms of the intellectual property and also, the dollar amount in terms of how to use these assets. But yeah, Meredith, you're correct, built into it. In some ways, we have slowly moved as a K-12 environment that if you buy 100 chemistry books a year, next year you probably need to buy 5 to replace them for the 2 that were lost in the parking lot, 3 that had something else happened to them. And it's kind of the cost of doing business to make sure that we've got, in some ways, more of a consumable expense.
So I'm trying to figure out how I position my question. I'm struggling with this one, this OE, because it seems very processy to me. And not that I don't think it's great processes, but I almost feel that it gets us as a board in the needs of operations. So just looking at 7.4, our district has a recovery plan, disaster and recovery plan that is implemented to protect critical data in the system. Great. But then, I guess I just don't know how we would measure compliance, and I don't know if this is a question for admin or for us as a board. Do we actually need specific indicators, or is an indicator we have car insurance, good enough? It doesn't have to start to get we have car insurance that covers this and this and this and that. I don't know if that's an admin question or if that's a board question, but I know we talked about this before with they've given us more information than we really need to say, yep, we can say we're in compliance with that. And with this one, I'm just struggling with how do we say from this information, we know that our intellectual property is in fact protected and haven't experienced any processing. And I have notes on some of the other ones that say the same thing. And I'm just curious, and again, Meredith, I don't know if this is this time or when we accept it and then it's our time. I'm just curious about that piece of it. I'm having a hard time with accepting a lot of this because of the processing piece.
Can I ask kind of a follow-up question to that? So I kind of thought the same thing, what this reminded me of, again, kind of different industry. But when we had to be, the acronym, but credit card processing certified, a lot of the certification was actually, do you have a plan in place? Or do you have processes in place? And actually, that was the certification that then qualified you for a next level of insurance, or to be able to waive off certain penalties. But then on the flip side, people follow that process. You still have the brand, right? Yeah. You're not acting really bad for your brand. And so that does feel like the middle area that we're in. But they, in the credit card processing space, they were never able to identify a meaningful indicator that could capture that brand piece. And they did very similarly list out things such as this to say, this gets you 80% of the way there, that should establish those best practices, and in the plan covers those things. So I'm not sure if that helps at all.
I think it does. I think one thing to remember is that our indicators that either need to be measurable and or observable. And some of these processes are observable, they're in place. They are a bit kind of checkbox, but the fact that they are in place is kind of satisfies the observable. I struggle with the processes versus the, I think that's an evolution, but I think that's a good way of assessing it. let's make sure, hang on, let's make sure we have questions for Chad about any of the clarifications about what's in there.
Yes, this is a question along these lines, but for Chad, because I don't know what I'm talking about. So indicator 3 of 7.4, the district will maintain an inventory of the physical assets to safeguard against theft or losses. That's a checkboxy thing. I'm assuming you could also just as easily, or not just as easily, you could also say that by theft or losses will be less than some percentage of the inventory that you maintain. Which would be more of a statistic thing. I'm not sure that that's possible. So my question is that possible, or is that a difference that makes sense in this context?
Can I add one piece to your question?
Sure, I don't know what I'm doing.
And I think that's my question too.
Well, I think that comes to the question that I would ask. And does that information help us as a board evaluate whether this policy can be followed?
Yeah, so I guess my question more refined would be like, is there a percentage loss there that you'd be concerned about? Or is it like 0?
Above the
Because I
possibility.
can't imagine that 0 is practical.
So. Is that the question?
I think so. Sorry.
No, that's good, it's fine. So as we, again, I use this word grappling with it, we tried to start doing this process of the tag. So we looked at protect, what do we really mean by protect? And then everything that's in the middle, and then protecting loss and protecting significant damage. What I see, I don't ever want to be on the stage and I'm trying to explain to you why our tractors are no longer in our facilities. And I'm just using that, I mean, that's a pretty big but. And so I think about, I think about this question of how did you not know that, that this stuff was missing? How did you not know that the cases of textbooks were not there? And you answer that by, we have to take proper inventory to be able to know that I can answer the question that when we did inventory, everything that we said that we had as a value asset, we can prove that it's there. And so for me, it wasn't as much as what was in the inside of it, as like, how do we provide accurate documentation that, in like a scenario that the opposite end of this, that these things are missing. Well, here, we did our check on this date, these items are there. And here's our proof. And when we look at the inwards, we did that for each of the indicators and stuff. It was, what do we mean by protect? And then what is the, and what are we protecting? Not what are we protecting, but we're protecting those things from loss or something. For us, it didn't really matter as much what was on the inside, that's how we went to
It is where you get to exactly right. You could maintain an inventory. The inventory could be, everything was stolen, but the checkbox of inventory could be checked. It doesn't say you will maintain a successful inventory or an inventory that proves that not more than 20% of your stuff was stolen or something like that. I kind of see where that's.
I think this is where we debate as.
Yes, you're going outside our.
Yeah, are reasonable, but I also think, to John's point, I think, if we're taking it beyond the process, we have to make sure that taking it beyond the process is actually going to help us evaluate. So if you said to me, less than 20% was lost, I don't know that that would help me. What's normal? I mean, what's an average, yearly loss? If you're saying there's going to be an inventory, I would imagine as a part of that inventory, if something was missing, there would be an accounting and an explanation. So when we had the tornado, there's like, here's fixed assets that have been damaged through X, Y, and Z. What I think I'm looking at this thing, I think along the lines of your hypothetical, I think this is first of all a new framework for the board we're living in. It is process oriented in a lot of cases, but I'm not sure that anything beyond, I'm not sure that there's additional information in some of these indicators that would actually help me evaluate whether or not we were in compliance at this point. We may look at this in a year with a deeper understanding of how this has gone and say, okay, now that I've seen this and I've seen how you reported it, I think we can change some of the indicators, pull these out, but maybe we just need this one thing. So I think from where we are now, this makes as much sense as anything. Like, I think we're a little blind in how we want to evaluate things. But we may have a different opinion once we've gone through the cycle and see the reporting back. Yes. Yeah.
I have one question to offer. Would it be something, when you ask the question, how does this help me do my job as board member, which is a really great question to ask. The only thing I would care about is if the theft rate went above for whatever you budgeted. Your example of like the textbooks, right? Like I have 100 textbooks. Kids are lucky and they might have something of them. So I'm budgeting to know. And so I wonder if that's an area to like not get too much into the weeds, but to say, hey, whatever risk that we're taking, it's what we anticipated and what we budgeted for and nothing more. Again, that would be the only, when you ask that question there, which I think is equivalent, that's the only thing that jumped to my mind of like, could that be a reasonable indicator that this team could measure and would distract us from what we care about, which is we're not leaking money to unreasonable factors.
So I think that part of this narrative is us taking it to us as a board to really look at what we're asking for, right? Because when our policy says from loss or significant damage, I need to know what that means. And if we can't identify what that means and our administration can't identify what that means, then we need to look at the policy that we created. And I think that's a board thing, right? And so if we're struggling to say, we don't actually know what loss or significant damage really is, then we never actually know if we've experienced loss or significant damage. So is that I think that's something, and I don't know in this process where that goes, but I think that's something that this OE in particular kind of makes us look at with, do our policies actually get us as a board to what it is we're hoping happens and within practice. And I think, I don't know that we're sure about that right now. I feel like we're,
So let's hold on that. Let's make sure, are there any questions that are strictly about the content of the agenda?
I have one. Could you help me understand one of the indicators? OE 7.3, indicator 2. The last part of the sentence, I just would like to kind of know what that means.
Segregated duties.
Yeah, like finance staff with segregated duties verified.
Yep. And I had a conversation with Yana, so I think these two indicators are connected.
Okay.
So segregated duties in the world of accounting is as simple as Jen can't be the person that enters a request for payment into a system, approve it, and cut yourself a check. That you have to have maybe someone at a site saying, we owe this money to a vendor. They send a request for payment to Pete in the finance office. Pete gets his amendment, verifies the correct account number, verifies that's in the board policy, and okays the fact that we cut a check. Pete doesn't cut the check. Someone else in the finance office cuts the check. So 3 different people have eyes on it to verify that. And it's never going to be perfect. If people want to find a way to steal, eventually we'll catch them, but they can. But that means 3 different people had eyes on money and wanted to win the district. That's segregation of duties.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
While we're on the OE, I have a question, just, and it's probably a very simple answer for you. In the definition terms for any personnel, do I interpret this to mean that we don't have, that everyone who has access to school district funds is either a district employee or volunteer? We don't have like independent contractors or outside vendors that have access to our funds?
That is a fair statement. We obviously pay outside contractors.
Right.
There is no one that, in fact, I struggle minus that, someone from the booster club running an activity account. That are, for the most part, 99% of the money that has up the district comes from the district employee improvement. And even the money from the activity account still touches the hands of 3 district employees before it goes back out.
I have another question on 7.1 this time, on indicator 1. I'm just a little bit confused by the phrasing. It says property and contents insurance is at 100% replacement value, except we're limited by the carrier. What does that mean? Does that mean that you might not have to insure to 100% replacement value if the carrier doesn't cover it?
Yep, or they won't. Yeah, exactly. So it's spots that the insurance carrier will only cover up to a certain threshold.
Any other clarifying questions?
I think I only have one more.
Okay.
This is the part of the work that I have to restrain myself. In 7.2, the definition of error and omissions insurance, it says protection from harm for board members and staff who make mistakes as part of good faith performance. Generally, I think of insurance coverage as broader than just when people make mistakes. It's when they're accused of making a mistake. So I would think a more accurate way to say that would be to protect against losses due to claims against people for these kinds of things, rather than limiting it to only situations where we actually make
That's the lawyer.
mistakes. I know it's insufferable. But
I was totally thinking the same.
don't worry.
No way.
So I have
I just want to add no rebuttal because it made too much sense.
so annoying.
So I have a question about 7.1, indicator 2. So in the definitions of property insurance, you have facilities, vehicles, equipment, and materials. What's the difference between indicator 2 and indicator 1? Does 1 not cover vehicles as does 2? 7.1. So you have property and contents insurance at 100%. What's the difference between, in the definition of terms, you have vehicles there as property insurance. Is there a difference between indicator 1 and indicator 2?
The main difference in my mind would be that it's a completely different insurance policy. Other than that,
Homeowners versus.
that's essentially what it is.
Okay, Chad, I think you probably just speak for us, just as we go through board discussion. We seem to be switching back and forth between boards and clarifying. All right, are there any additional clarifying questions?
I think it was a clear, I heard this come up a couple of times in this one, and just reiterate this graphic process. I heard, can indicators include measures like 20% of loss or 20%? And where we were getting essentially hung up on is that number means something totally different depending on the asset. If we lose 20% of our fleet, the board's looking for the superintendent. If we use,
They just bad.
20% of our checks, and we had so I would assume that we had a higher number of like textbook loss when everything was at home during the pandemic, so that number may have gone up. So we really shied away from that number because we can't say, well, this asset is 20% and that asset is 5%, this asset is 1%. So I just want to kind of get some rationale when we talk about numbers when we take into these indicators.
And I think definitely related to that, I know we spent quite a bit of time on 7.4. I think a potential indicator is get hacked and held ransom for over $7,000 in any given year. And we didn't think it would, at least for the time being, we were comfortable putting a number to measuring some of this stuff. And that's why it ended up more of observable processes and less around trying to actually put a metric to some of it.
I think this gets at what I struggle with we're not supposed to look at process is that there are times when process is an indicator. That
Yes.
following a process is an indication that you're doing the thing we're telling you to do. And that's why when I look to something like an inventory, that's a process, right? We're gonna inventory all our fixed assets, but it's also an indicator. It'd be different if we were saying, we're gonna keep track of everything. That's just a process, but at least an inventory is like, I could say, okay, give me the inventory so I can see it if I want proof. So I mean, that is both a process, but it's also an indicator.
Can I?
I'm sorry.
No.
Sorry.
I just interrupted the board member, and that's not your name. But you're talking about the difference between having an inventory and verifying an inventory, right? Like, the indicator would be that the inventory has been verified. Am I misunderstanding?
No, I think we're getting at the same thing. In my mind, maintaining an inventory means that it's accurate. If it's not accurate, it's not a maintained inventory. If your inventory says your tractor's in the barn, and the tractor's not in the barn, that's not a maintained inventory.
And everything that comes to us is certified as accurate, that's superintendent by virtue of funding us.
So can I ask one, I do realize I have one more question for you. So when you are budgeting, because when we get to the board actual conversation about this, I have a phrase that I think could like solve this without being too specific, but with being a little more specific of like, it's outside of what you budgeted for in here. Do you actually budget for like, we budget year over year, that, 10% of our kids will bring their iPads? Or we budget for, or we don't even have to budget for that because we have great insurance through Apple, because we're an education system. Like, is that something we plan for in the budgeting process?
Yeah, I certainly think it is planned for. I think that it becomes less exact as you work your way through examples. So Pam has a $4,500 a year budget for our chemistry department. Loosely, the department chair for the chemistry department budgeted for lost test tubes and broken Bunsen burners, but doesn't get down to the fact that I've got 2 Bunsen burners in the budget for next year. If 3 fizzled out, he buys 3. And I think there's a continuum that maybe in the world of tech, certainly we know now that the tech plan's been off the ground now for a number of years, how many replacement devices on an annual basis we've been averaging, and that gets built into the budget. So I think it can be incredibly exact in some places that, our buildings and grounds crew knows how many plows we're going to replace next year. They're not lost, but they are broken from hitting curves, during a deep snowfall. And that's in the budget that we have to, work our way through maintaining those items, but in some cases, it's far less exact.
And I think it's also important to remember that in most of the examples that we've used here to try and conceptualize how we're thinking about this, we're talking about fixed assets that are below $5,000, so they wouldn't be covered by that OE. And I think in terms of expected loss, tell me if I'm wrong, I think that when you start talking about assets above $5,000, you're not dealing with the same level of expected loss that you do with pencils.
Most of those items are covered by our insurance policy in the event that something would pop that would be over $5,000.
And even the example you used with the plow, that wouldn't be the type of loss we're even talking about with this OE, because that's damage.
Right, that comes up a little bit later in terms of how we maintain our assets.
Yeah.
But,
Okay, any last clarifying questions? And if not, I will accept a motion to accept the interpretations and indicators as presented for this summer. So I have a motion from Nicole, do I have a second? Second from Jen. Okay, board, we are now putting this into our only down here, but I want to really just, I think we've raised some good issues. I think, again, observable and, and or measurable. Something can be observable as a indicator. I also just want to kind of just reiterate that we are not putting our judgment about indicators that we would prefer. These aren't our preferences. These are they reasonable? If we have indicators that if we're not able to evaluate compliance of the policy, then we would send it back for an indicator to be developed by Dr. Clarity and Chad. We don't develop the indicator. And I think this is one of those tough ones that
it is a lot of process, but I think Joe made a really good point about that. That's also an indicator in many senses. I also want to give us the year of monitoring to get through this process, because we may come back in a year much more mature in our processing about how we want to do this.
Mature is a big word.
The rest of us that job will come back.
So I just want to give, I want to give us that time for growth. I want to give the administration that time. And again, we're looking at reasonably. So that said, we can start the board discussion.
I will start by saying, hearing the discussions around it, I didn't catch all of it, but you said maintain an inventory, and it assumes reasonably that it's a successful inventory. Someone would be like, oh, everything's gone, inventory done. And you said that the superintendent has to verify those. So, and also with my understanding of indicator one, I think that's a kind of acceptable process. So I'm okay, and thank you for answering all of our TV's questions.
Thank you.
It was to you too, yeah.
I had one that I should have brought up earlier, but I didn't know which part of this should be in. Is 7.9, the first indicator, which is positive image in the community as evidenced by community survey responses. Is that measurable? I mean, how do we know what level of survey responses is sufficient evidence of positive image? Is it 51%? Is it higher? That's one of the things I struggle with looking at that.
I'm not having a number go back.
Yeah, it's just, even if I got the survey results, I wouldn't be able to take those results of a survey and say, okay, is this a positive image or not? I mean, depending on. But then again, I was thinking about it in terms of like a percentage response, but that's thinking about it in terms of one question. But I'm sure it's not a question of do you have a positive image?
It actually is. It's a power question.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. Things that come up as indicators and we put surveys to that we power questions in our surveys.
Well, then what would you consider to be a positive image? What response would you consider to be a positive image?
With the high expectations that we have, it's definitely in the 75 to 80%. Like I said,
No, it's okay. And then that's when I was thinking about these indicators in terms of being measurable, that's more what I would expect. Not necessarily to set too high a standard.
But you're looking for like a CSAT
Yeah.
or something.
I think this is a good place where it's like, yes, that's a great thought for next year.
Okay.
As we get there and can see like, okay, we did this survey, we got some results back.
You have a baseline.
Right.
That's a good point.
And are we determining reasonable? I agree. I think that it's good to know what are we shooting for, but I don't even have a frame of reference about what would be a reasonable target. So just kind of setting this as a placeholder. Yeah.
It'll be a survey.
That's a thought I had about that one, was you also have to consider the outside context. So if you were asking that question in the middle of the pandemic, we had some kind of benchmark from prior to the pandemic and then middle of the pandemic, would you be thinking, wow, is it really because the superintendent took an action to stand for public image, or is it because we are in a situation where there's a lot of upset people? I'm just saying that as a board, we have to think about that, because that may not really be come down to the superintendent's action, that may come down to being super frustrated because the pandemic. So there's a lot of impact how we monitor media. Yeah, I think that'll be all the things that are taken into consideration. Are we comfortable moving forward with that indicator without a specific percentage at this time?
Yes. I
I think it'll start a conversation.
I think so too. Okay, any other, Jen?
Yeah, I just had one that I think showed up in two different indicators, and again, this I think is a question about just what these indicators, I guess my assumption at this point is the indicators feel driven by admin, right? Like information coming to us, and we take that to then, right, decide compliance or not compliance. Two of the indicators state, so one of them is under OE 7.9, indicator 2, the board does not identify, et cetera, et cetera. So that indicator sounds and feels different to me, that we've now somehow done the research behind an indicator, it's not coming to us. And there's two of those, so I don't really know, so I'm just surfacing that as a wondering, because everything else has been very, like, we are getting this and taking this information from admin.
Just, if I would put my thought on this based
Yeah,
on
please.
this past experience, I mean, if something came up where that indicator was triggered, we would know. We would know by interview response, we would know by media, we would know. There would be. That's where you say something.
Yeah, I agree with that, and you're right, because as we were going over this one, to your point, normally I would present to you,
Right.
but this one is specifically about the superintendent,
Oh, yeah.
and so I couldn't then be the, oh, no, I didn't.
You tell me what you did. Sure.
Yes, that actually was, it's more intentional.
Yeah.
because You have to be the owner of the information for that one, because my
It is
role,
about
my role is.
your evaluation. That's helpful. I needed to put some voice to that, just because reading it just sounded different, right? And, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Can I just? I agree with what we're saying for the first one about the superintendent's report. My concern with 7.9 indicators is that it seems very subjective. And I wonder if it's more reasonable to include the word materially damaging the district's public energy credibility. Because it seems like it's open to a board member saying, well, I disagree with this policy, and I'm going to argue that you implementing this policy has damaged the district's public image, and that this is an outlet for me to do that, which I think would be entirely inappropriate. But I can foresee that being a possibility. Am I bringing up a reasonable concern or not?
Wouldn't the rest of the board then say at that point, John, you're kind of being unreasonable?
I'm very convinced.
I know.
You're right, it's a board action, I mean, the board is taking, this isn't the board's, it's not a board member identifying like the investigation. This is the, and if the board as an entity made that determination, that's a pretty high bar.
It is a
I think John's right. I mean, it is a subjective term, but adding materially to it is still subjective.
Yeah.
And it's still open to the exact same situation.
positive images. My biggest.
There's a few of those that your process is subject to review.
And I think that comes back to the board's task with, has reasonable progress been made in your results, as compliance been reasonably achieved, and I think that goes back to the reasonable standard. If we have a board full of unreasonable people, then the superintendent is in trouble, but I think at this point, we have a very reasonable board. But again, it's not a board member, it's board member.
And maybe some of this even comes back to beyond this point of maybe it means we look at how we phrase the policies to begin with too.
And that's something
So,
that we can,
yeah,
take a look at.
exactly.
At our year-round
Yeah.
review as well. And we should be reviewing our policies, annually to make sure that they're updated and fully capturing our intentions for the board.
I think that when I look at this one, I'm really struggling with this one, really struggling. And I think, again, this may just be something that maybe I'm struggling with our policy, so I will go back to that, but I almost wonder, are we asking for, and this is also the board, are we asking, do we necessarily need so many processes, right? I think we talked about in one of our other OEs, the way that we measure that is our audit. Okay, so then our audit is good enough. There were like 3 indicators that just said our audit comes back clean. All right, our audit comes back clean. It almost seems like in order to get indicators, we're like trying to find indicators. And some of them are as simple as, we have insurance. That's the indicator. And so to me, it's like, which is difficult because we're all learning this, but it almost seems like we're trying to like create indicators that don't need to be created. It's something as simple as,
But I think we don't create indicators. I agree with you.
or stuff.
Right. No, I mean our administration. They're like, okay, how can we prove that this happens? And some of it is as simple as the audit came up with, right? Like, and they're like, well, we kind of used that already, so maybe we need to pull something else. Like, no, it's that simple. I think we're running into, like, we were trying to like, our administration was trying to figure out how to measure something, and some of it is just simple as, we have insurance, or we have a lawyer who ensures that, if anything comes up, we can deal with it. Like, it's not, they're almost trying to create something that they don't necessarily need to create, which is why I'm struggling, because it is processy, and I almost feel like that has been the kind of the expectation of the board, but we just don't know, like, how some of this stuff resonates in process. And so when we look at it and say, all of our coverage, Joe asked, like, why 100% accept, right? Like, okay, that makes sense. We have insurance, it covers 100% unless they say that it doesn't. All right, fine, that's enough, but we don't have to, like, add something extra, and it feels like we're adding something extra to, like, prove that they're actually doing their job. They're doing it.
So we're at like out of meeting right now, so I want to make sure that we get through this in a way that it is organized. So let's start at the top and we go from the very top of policy. Are we in agreement with the interpretation of the overall policy for just OE7? Okay, so let's move on to OE7.1. We have our interpretation and we have indicators. Is there anything here that is unreasonable, where to the point where we did not accept it as a board? Keeping in mind that we may revise indicators in a year's time with some experience on both sides. Anything unreasonable at OE 7.1? Okay, anything on 7.2?
We added the language that Joe suggested earlier.
Seven, and just, do we have that in our minutes? Yeah, you just will accept that as part of, that was accepted, we didn't make any. 7.2, 7.3.
Meredith, what's your question here, just to be clear on what we're,
I just wanted to make sure that the indicators and the interpretations of the indicators are reasonable. So let's flag anything that is unreasonable as we go through the process, so it's not a blanket. That we're pinpointing, if we need changes, we can actually identify the changes in specific locations, so we can move forward in a process way.
I don't agree with something, but I don't know that my one opinion trumps the other 6 people. So I'm having a hard time saying yay or nay, because some of them I don't agree with, and so it's a hard, like, your question is almost hard for me to answer, because I don't agree with something.
John, did you have a question?
Oh, I'm an expert at this. We're just gonna vote, you're gonna have it.
I was gonna ask you, but
I get outvoted all the time.
and I think that that's fine. I just want to make sure that, like, I don't think that the way we're doing this is like we're going through each one. And I personally just don't agree with the whole thing.
But
But have you said-
others may
Which
have
is
specific, yeah,
Right,
questions.
right,
So I want to go through and give everyone an opportunity to.
So yeah, if you say it.
7.4, anything specific?
I'm just gonna work through this out loud for a minute. I still struggle a little bit with the limiting fixed assets to that $5,000 limit, because that does mean, when it comes to the indicator of having the inventory of those fixed assets, that things like iPads under this OE do not need to be inventory, or that they're not out of compliance for not inventorying. Now, I know for sure that they are.
How much does an iPad cost?
I don't know, less than $5,000.
Totally. I'm just wondering if it's like $1,000? Is it an easy?
And that's kind of what I was, because there does need to be a limit.
Absolutely
Like,
needs
I
to
don't
be.
want them to have to inventory every pencil and eraser that comes to the district. But it's whether or not $5,000 adequately protects fixed assets that, while they're less than $5,000 individually in the aggregate.
I think to that point, Joe, I personally would like to see a definition of loss or significant damage. What does that mean to administration? Because we could have a totally different definition as board members. So to your point, right, when you say an iPad, to you, that could be lost or significant damage that we're not sure if that's part of the, what is interpreted here. I think the interpretation is great. I'm just wondering how our administration defines lost or significant damage.
So in that case, if this is something that you want to have, a motion to amend, to set aside for additional definition, and then we could vote that on this board, and if the board as a whole says, yes, we want to have that definition added, then that's added, we can go back and continue on with the policy at the time.
So and this might have been a question that I think we talked about it, and it's not coming back to mind. The way we came to $5,000 as an amount, I imagine it had something to do with what is practical to inventory versus not, right? Because every pencil would be impractical, so you gotta set a limit based on what you can actually account for.
You could have $5,000 worth of pencils. But I mentioned with the evidence,
Right.
I think that there are some major line item issues. But
But again, we're not wanting to do the line.
right.
I think that if we start, and I thought the same thing when you first brought this up, like, what is the definition of loss of significant damage? We could say, well, it should be specifically spelled out, but it is kind of in terms of this $5,000 limit. It's just. Right.
It could be. I think that's where we send back to see what that means. We may find that like, we can't actually define loss or significant damage. I think then us as a board have to realize that we created a policy that is not, that doesn't. Yeah.
I think right now, we need to decide, if you feel like this needs to be defined, then put it up for vote, and the board can have a say in whether or not it's defined.
Or the reasonableness is there.
But that doesn't mean, a board member can have an opinion and make it that motion. If it doesn't get second, then it's not, and the board doesn't have to go along with it. But a board member does have the ability to request for amendments to be made. We just need to vote on it as a board to have those amendments made.
So I guess I'm just struggling because I feel like there's like part of what I'm looking for, that's also part of what Joe is asking with that fixed number, and I think
they're two different motions.
I think, well, I don't know. I think that's where that's where the hesitance is. I'm trying to figure out like, if you define loss, there's significant damage, then does the $5,000 mark make sense? Or if the $5,000 mark makes sense, then loss and significant damage makes sense? Like, I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, can I say my thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Because in the policy on 7.4, it says you only have to protect fixed assets from loss or significant damage. So if everything under 5,000 is not considered a fixed asset, then it doesn't matter how you define loss or significant damage for that property. So I do think they're separate, or, I mean, that doesn't mean you can't tackle them together, but I don't know that defining loss and significant damage, which I agree with you, I think we need to do.
Can we propose them separately? Because personally, I have no issue with loss or significant damage. The iPad thing is really bothering me now that you brought it up. I can't unsee it. And I would love, like that piece, I would love redefined, or administration to come back and be like, so you realize by lowering this to 1,000, you've now included this, and this will materially make this monitoring very difficult.
That's what my hesitation is right now, even though I'm the one who pointed out this problem. I don't want to over-capture things that's gonna make it too burdensome.
So, can I just, as someone who's been through the iPad replacement policy, like, there are like 5,000 iPads out there. I can assure you that they are accounted for when a student breaks them. All right. I think that the larger questions around how things are defined or spelled out are things that we can take up when we maybe look at rewording this I think for me, the questions for both of these issues, all three of these issues, centers around whether or not $5,000 is a reasonable limit to set. Not knowing how all of the line-by-line items break down, and not being an expert at accounting, I'm willing to accept that 5,000 is a reasonable assumption right now. I think when we go to monitor this, and we look at the audits for our budget in particular, if we have questions comparing the two, like there are losses that are not accounted for in the budget, that would be something that I would trust that they would be reporting and that would be caught through some of this stuff. And maybe then we have to revise whether or not that's a reasonable assumption. I'm really struggling to find out or to feel like 5,000 is unreasonable. It might not be my personal choice, but I'm trying to and I'm really, I'm trying to get to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where I started from too. I really struggled with, even though I was the one who brought this issue up, I'm not sure whether to me that's even unreasonable.
Right.
So maybe if we can't define it as unreasonable,
Yeah.
and if we accept it as reasonable and move on.
Yeah, I evaluate in a year, if we're not very like, okay, we're seeing gaps, or we're seeing,
Right.
changes.
I think I'm fine with standing down. Because I don't really know what I'm standing up for, so I'm just gonna.
I was really hoping somebody else would get voted down for a change.
It's also 9 o'clock, and you guys know I don't think I'm hurried, so I'm struggling right now.
So speaking of, respectfully, I'm listening to my staff, my team.
Yeah.
Pete, if you see Dr. Hawkins, please go. Marcy, you've been on 5 days and just, I'm not sure if you're running the laptop right there, but be safe out there, please.
Okay.
And then what I'd like to put that into 3:30, Chad, I think that was 3:30 this morning. So let's continue with this conversation, but let's be respectful of the fact that now, at this point, guys, we're just gonna keep you up till Wednesday. Okay, so if we said 7.5, we're on. Are there any questions of reasonableness on 7.5? Okay, and none, 7.6? 7.7? 7.8? 7.9? Okay, I'm hearing no questions of reasonableness. At this point, are we ready to vote on accepting the interpretations of indicators as presented by the administration? All in favor, signify with aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
Okay, this motion passes. Thank you, board. This was good working through, and thank you to the administration. And this is a long day for you. With that said, I would like to, and I'm assuming we do not have any public comment tonight.
It's long.
It's a assumption.
Can we just, I just want to say, dear public, like, this is really good stuff. Like, this is what we're supposed to be talking about as a school board.
Okay, let's keep in mind, 3 hours.
I'm just, that's all I'm saying.
Okay, so, I would like just to point out, for, the communication committee, they had a meeting, a 1-minute brief update. That was fantastic.
So we had our first meeting last Thursday, it was a virtual meeting, and we're glad to have Marcy. We decided to call ourselves Communications Board Group. We set 2 more meetings, and I will make sure the rest of the board knows what those meetings are in case anybody wants to drop in on those. And then we talked about kind of what, we didn't get very far yet, but what we want to do, what our charge is as a community in terms of defining board communities with the community. So we didn't get very far into the Aspen recommendations, but we did talk about coming up with kind of like a draft outline of what we were proposing, because the board would eventually see that. So yes, we will tell you next, our next 2 meetings will both be Zoom meetings, and any board member who would like to pop in on one is certainly welcome to do so. And that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Sorry, Kristen, you didn't, that's all communications.
No, the only thing I would say is we are going to be very cognizant of making sure wherever we outline that we're very aware of what's going on referendum-wise, so that we aren't creating some kind of community involvement fatigue. Like we do want to go out and do some listening sessions,
we do want to be aware that the community can only participate, so much, so we don't want to be overlapping too much with the other.
Thank you all for your time on this. Additional updates you will hear. Moving on to the consent agenda for the superintendent. Please. Are there any questions? Again, it's on the retirements that we've seen earlier, so unfortunately, I think all we were not to accept these motions. We are bound to sadly accept this motion. No questions, this superintendent's consent agenda passes. We have the board consent agenda. We have some meeting minutes. Any questions or clarifications? Hearing none, the board's consent agenda passes. We have future agenda items as listed. We also have the board debrief, but in the interest of time, I really would just like everyone, as we have gone through the debrief process, we've been taking a look at the board job. I want to go through all of our board governance policies as we go through this process. Please take a look at the board code of conduct. That's one we will hold over for next time, but I want to make sure that we're working our way through all of our GCs in some type of organized fashion, but not at the expense of our administration, who is probably ready to collapse. So, with that said, if there's no further questions, I will call this, is there a motion to adjourn? Someone, a motion to down, and do I have a second? Second from Nicole. All in favor of adjourning? Aye. This meeting is adjourned.
And Susie, thank you. I'm so sorry for